Alrighty. I had another conversation a while back with a very special person. And when I met him, it was one of those things where I didn't quite know how to talk to him or how to act. I was nervous. I was excited. This recording isn't the first time we talked. We met several months ago. And this man is Richard Liederner, or Jampa Dorje. I was admittedly not at full mental or energetic capacity for this, and it also did go on for 3 hours, which I decided to just let it go because I thought it was just special to record him. But eventually I will work on providing timestamps with general topics in the description or in the comments somewhere. And since he's so special, such a unique individual, even though it's a very disorganized and long podcast, I decided I'm just putting it out there because I'd rather put it out there than leave it. He is, among many, many other things, an ordained Tibetan Buddhist monk, poet, and writer. He went to UC Berkeley during the counterculture era and very much considered himself what mainstream America would have called a hippie. Although he has told me several times that he and his other fellow freaks would prefer terms such as bohemian or freak or some others, but those were kind of the OG ones, or the beats, the beat generation, the beat followers, whatever. All these things. He lived in a cabin in Southeast Alaska for several years, and right now he's in Ellensburg, Washington. Now, what I have provided you is a relatively organized summary of his life, which really only scratches the surface of the contents of his life and of the substance of his life. I'll leave it to him to describe his experiences and his stories and his thoughts and philosophies. Again, for me, was a special person to have on. It's kind of nuts that he's in this little town of Ellensburg. That brain of his just been here for all these years.
Looking for my collected phones. Peek out behind us. Say hello. This is an old geezer with a collected phones. I'm into my parlor phone. Here with my red Buddha Tonka.
Very well, thanks a lot for doing this. I'm excited to see where it'll go. I'm trying not to control too much where it goes because talking with you, it always takes itself in interesting directions.
You were thinking of adding music or something. That interests me. Did you receive that totally nihilistic piece that I did with Steve Fisk? Did you look at that?
I actually haven't looked at that.
Well, research myself, son. This falls into a lineage of great classical sampling collage-like thing.
Mm. Yeah, so, well, I don't even know where to begin with you, but what are you doing these days?
Well, at the moment, I'm doing this oral history, which should give some indication of who I am as a resident of Ellensburg, Washington, which is a place in the northwest, east of the mountains, they say. Little town that's called Ellensburg, but once was known as Robber's Roost. Not many people know about the Robber Roost side of it, but century before was this century before, in the cowboy days, there was outposts where outlaws hung out. And this was on the outlaw trail. I mean this town, I mean this place. A trading post. So if you're into mythology, I mean, these ideas of these kind of crossroad places where everything kind of can go to the four winds. I mean, metaphorically, but probably literally, because if any place, Ellensburg has this thing called the wind.
Right.
The logos don't refer to it, as they don't even talk about it. But if you notice, there is one. So that serves as sometimes a certain strata of unity for people that are attuned to this place and those that aren't. I mean, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
People get used to the place they're in if they stay for a long time. And even then it changes a lot. Ellensburg, say now, today, is nice, pretty warm, I don't know, maybe even 50s, and sort of spring-like, but still was 20 degrees in the morning, so it's still got this mountainside connected to this range of mountains. It makes its own weather, so you're caught in this high mountain valley between two forces, very strong forces. You know, a desert on one side and cascade rain from the other.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the whole history of this, to the robber's roost, and then how the town was a big cattle drive place and full of wild shenanigans around the turn of 1890s. Then the town burned up in some wild celebration. And actually, it just caught fire. I don't know, something left something on. And they suddenly realized that they had the potential, because Washington was becoming a state, to be the capital of the state. So at a political level, there was an incentive to rebuild the town. Brothels and bar rooms and the whole shebang were all over. And they had about, somebody say 3 months, let's say 6 months or something, before they could show off their town to be a viable option between Walla Walla and Olympia.
Actually didn't know about the history there.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it's again a little funny triangle or thing in there.
Mm-hmm.
History sometimes reveals these things that seem they could look like it has a special ley line or a special zone. It's a sacred spot. And the more you look, the more you say, oh, yeah, it could. The term kittitas comes from some word kittitas, which was a plant that was food that gave everybody something to eat. So it was thought of as plenty. And they always came, Indians from everywhere, to sort of do summer camp here, and nobody fought. Fairly violent tribes, and so it's known as the land of peace and plenty. That was what it was.
So I guess what I'm really interested in getting to is, well, you're the kind of person where when I talked to you, or when I found out you existed, I felt that I had discovered this like giant old library or something.
Well, you probably met me about the time I was working for, special collections in Brooks Library was where we met. And Brooks Library is where Johnny, was it Johnny's or Jimmy's, Jimmy B's, where we had tea. Right? So I was dealing with this big library project for that year. It took a year to install a collection of local authors, so that the collected poems would have a home.
Mm-hmm. So like
Amazon.
Yeah, I'll put links to I'll put links in the description to various places, but yeah, so we
don't put the or don't put the.
And you thought I remember I that was at a time where I suddenly was very interested in maybe even leaving and being a Buddhist for a while, but now I'm like, well, I don't know. It's
Well,
because
we discourage people because it seems like it could complicate your entire life around
yeah,
an issue most people can solve within their own cultural milieu. So
yeah,
Christianity or not, atheism, empiricism, various skeptical forms that were connected to the empirical mind, deconstructionism and so forth, those are ways to hold together a world
yeah,
that don't require a god or a Buddha or anything like that. You're supposed to do it on your own.
yeah, and that's why I have become more interested in less interested in following the doctrine of a religion and more interested in just reading about this stuff, reading about philosophy, reading
Well,
about religious studies, stuff like that.
all knowledge translates into wisdom. This is old Aristotelian stuff. Aristotle saw the wise man as somebody that had a lot of knowledge that could synthesize, and it would all become something like what's wisdom, but especially it's an understanding using reason to arrive at the synthesis of knowledge.
Hmm.
That's true or verifiable to some extent. Over and above the 12 gods that are jumping around, raping and castrating one another and tearing one another apart, which
Yeah,
is generally the background scene of chaos to a thought. Like, ignore those 12 fuck ups up there and look at this other fuck up down here.
yeah,
It, you know, it's on the ground. It has a certain lifespan that can sort of think. The term think is still kind of questionable, but
mhm,
reflect is.
mhm.
I'm happy with reflect.
Yeah. Let's talk about meditation for a bit and thoughts and stuff. So I
Thought.
mean,
They don't go hand in hand, but their fingers are intertwined.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess we've talked a bit about the nature,
I need to write that one down. Their fingers are intertwined.
the
I
finger.
got to get that one before. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, this is a little addendum on the creative process. they they go hand in hand, if I can write that. But without their fingers intertwined. And this idea takes me to Deleuze's idea that all little events are interassemblaged hierarchies, that they're little like machines that work together to make a bigger machine that tends to control certain areas. Because you're always working with all these, you can't reduce it down to just your ancient past. You've got to deal with all this present stuff. Anyway, somehow that might go into my next thing. Thanks. It was the muse, right? You drop in?
Yeah.
Look, yep. She does that.
I would I would really like to. So how often do you meditate and what
Oh,
do you
man,
do?
that's a different project, mental project.
Hmm.
That was a creative project that just
Yeah.
some semblance of a creative project. A meditative project doesn't have, uh, has the same props. I think to some extent one has to believe there is a reality. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to talk about it as though there were a reality. I mean, you begin talking about emptiness, emptiness, emptiness,
Hmm.
and it's exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so given there's this world of things and intersections of time and space or whatever, I think I might have lost it having assumed. Um, but we have to handle events. Is this on track? We have to handle events.
Yeah.
Will that connect? So we have to create some symbolic context for the brain to do something to handle reality. Kant would say you have to have the understanding, and you have to have the knowledge, and then you use reason. But so there's sort of three faculties involved, and so the one part of it is the reason is that you have some practical use, and so if you have some practical use for this, that you can apply your knowledge and understanding to something, you've got to create a schema. You've got to create so that you use the reason to do that. Otherwise, the understanding and the imagination don't have that on their agenda. They're fine without it. Making a poem is not part of a schema to accomplish anything.
Of course.
Right. So a meditation sort of recognizes that in an inherent nature of reality. It has no purpose or goal or anything.
It's just to see, to witness what's exactly the way things are, to witness what's happening, right?
You're just doing the witnessing.
Yeah, like, and oh boy.
Well, the first time, yeah. So, I mean, the first teaching is just to recognize that it's a problem with the reality. And then you have to say, well, then you should get rid of that part by meditating. Well, it doesn't take you anywhere, and you don't get rid of anything because there wasn't anything in the first place. So you're back to the self, which is fully self-aware that it is aware of itself in itself. What Deleuze calls a body with organs, and then they get, I mean, the scientists get so wrapped up around the organs, whether or not these organs can be saved, which takes everything off in its own areas, medicine and law, everything. It's institution. What you would call these other machines that have their own agendas, and they are not always in the same combination. So it sounds a little crazy, because it is. It's a schizo way of thinking. I mean, there's no denying that, going into that kind of thinking. I mean, if artists do it because, I mean, that are creating because we see it as a big untapped well of information that can be used to form into weird ideas that somehow reflect ourselves. And so therefore we grapple with that. But we realize at the same time that as far as truth goes, it doesn't matter. It creates lies like it creates truths, or creates what it creates. And so therefore truth is both lies and not truth. Right. Which is somehow transcendent or something that's hard to grapple with that. Maybe not even important if sort of you can keep your eye on the ball. You don't get smacked in the face with a tennis racket. Something, I mean, manage to get through the day by day. But Kant doesn't set a very high bar for what it takes to survive through the use of this faculty. We've made a big deal out of it, I think. Therefore, whether it's necessary to go through this kind of critique that's suggested in that pathway of just sitting out.
Yeah, what you're just saying about truth resonates, because whenever I try to figure out whenever I try to figure out what truth is, what it means when something is true, my brain starts to go into some weird places. Get into epistemology.
I mean, it's a study of ethics and philosophy. We have an entire field there.
Yeah, actually, right, of course.
Increasingly, the bigger field is ethics. So, and however, it hooks into Eastern religion has more. There's sort of a difference between ethics and morality, because ethics is so tied in the Western tradition with law, and morality with the church. And even though they overlap and are intertwined, they tend to still go two different paths. Sometimes they're in sync, and sometimes they aren't. So your morality issues are often tied to your cultural background, how you were raised, with the myths that support your, I got in there by osmosis,
Mm.
just from the smell of the place, how you absorbed your culture.
What sort of culture were you raised in? Were you raised in a Christian
Very
culture
rare,
or?
very rare. I got to be in. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I do this number on myself because it seems sort of kind of like it's shocking. I think it is, and I think it's what I was is kind of a normal adopted kid who had been adopted. And see, this is already obscured, but because the thing is, so much is tied to what your family lineage is and whether or not you're a part of a family. And this can get, if you do Freud, this gets real Oedipal. I mean, if you're trying to figure out that family structure and the dynamics of every family structure as to why anybody does anything, you do Freud. And I grew up in the time when Freud was very the thing. I mean, if you didn't have your Freudian analyst, well, you didn't have enough followers. I mean, it's like today, you gotta have your fucking analyst. I mean, you couldn't sit and drink your martinis without talking about your analyst, and then things you couldn't say. And all the movies were all tied into playwrights, Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill, things like all that stuff. The Southern Streetcar Named Desire and all that kind of history of literature that a lot of people probably have forgotten, but were once the rage, was all psychoanalytic. So you had to deal with your inner forces of Dionysian going out of control. And there was so wherever you were, if you were in Louisiana or if you were in New York or if you were in San Francisco or something, everybody could resonate to that. Maybe not out on a farm, but somewhere in the bigger urban areas, everybody had the same language. So let's see. The business of the psychoanalyst then is to sort of try to make you normal. By some standard that was sort of designed. In the history of psychoanalysis, which was roughly from 1900 to I came in 1958, so 60, 70 years. They'd been working on that thing. So you had a session. Or I could go to my pastor. Sometimes he was a minister, sometimes a pastor, whether I was a Presbyterian or a Methodist. I was always drawn to the Quakers.
Interesting.
But my parents were not quietists in that sense. But I had there were old ladies in my strange neighborhood in the Oakland Hills that were several generations there that went back to the older schools of intellectualism in Berkeley Hills, in those Berkeley Hills. Some of what is hard to explain why Berkeley is special is that if you think of Berkeley as a French English philosopher, a radical idealist, it all kind of comes down to a kind of vision that Berkeley had that Berkeley tried to realize in some kind of mystical sense. I mean, it was where they wanted the university to be, so it wasn't attractive to the Babylon, and they wanted to make it special, so they created all these early departments that are basically in place now, but they focused on nuclear physics, and so they created the heavy elements. And so the school was known for its Pulitzer Prize-winning physicists. So to go to school there, chemists, so to go to school there, what you wanted to be studying was physics and chemistry. My pastor or minister would advise against Elizabethan romantic poetry as a pathway between as a life path. I mean, you probably would too. Anybody in their right mind would say, no, I mean, I don't think there is a future to Elizabethan romantic poetry in this stage. I mean, but maybe there's some little niche in some university that's sort of interested.
So it sounds like you your early life was in the shadow, you would say it was in the shadow of the psychoanalyst, but also,
Well, the psychoanalyst was an element because the question was whether or not I had sanity if I was making choices like that. Some of which were shock jock-like statements to keep some identity in a very standard family, you might say. Not like a little richer than the um, um, Leave It to Beaver resonates there. I don't know if you know the Leave It to Beaver series.
well, I know the name, but people my age are very ignorant
It's a
on
way
so
to
many things.
classify what a sort of standard vision of an American family would look like, a nuclear family.
Oh, okay.
But it was pretty much a working class neighborhood. Well, I think he was white collar, so he probably worked in an insurance office or something. But my level of where I was would be his boss was the level of where my family was, because my family established those agencies. I mean, so that's where they separated them in a class, which post Second World War was important because the rich were taxed a lot. 80%, 85%, 90%. It was good for business. I mean, oddly enough, they don't seem to still follow that rule, but it was good for businesses. There were more of them. Now you got three. There was lots of businesses. Everybody had a business. Pretty good size. So business-wise, businesses is better, more, not less. Otherwise, they're conglomerates and they take over the economy. Well, in those days, we didn't see that coming. There was our president, General Eisenhower, said we needed to look out for the military-industrial complex. He saw it coming. But my family was more afraid that there was a communist under every bed. There almost was. No. I mean, there were other conspiracies, rampant conspiracies. I mean, just conspiracies are not new. They sometimes get more upfront in political dialogue, but there are always these currents, and media hasn't helped diminish that.
Right.
More attention to the shit that's going on anyway, just more under the covers.
And the kooky conspirators tend to get, the so-called kooky conspiracy theorists tend to get more of the attention from CNN and stuff like that.
Well, you can analyze it like that. For them, they make their money on perpetuating the loony tooniness of it. It's almost a comedy show in itself.
Yeah.
I'm enthralled by it, but I know it's not news. Well, other than it's Q news, and I wrote this book on conspiracy theory. It's called The Inquiry into Conspiracy Theory. So I was attuned to the development of it quite early. So the progressive and semantic qualities of the narrative interest me. People claiming to be family of Q and other hierarchies of Q, biblical Qs that have emerged out of places in the Balkan Mountains, or Bosnia Herzegovina, where people have visions of Q.
Actually, talk about Q for a sec. This shows.
No, I don't want to make this a Q story.
Like, what do you mean by Q when you say Q?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I know it's walking always a fine line, but according to the initial interpretation, it was a deep state entity, human, not without a sex, and possibly more than one, but for a long time thought as one, that had some clearance. The only deep state clearance of Q is in the energy department, so whether that's real or not, then this entity could through the deeper structures of the internet, posit things on message boards that then were read by a small group of acolytes. I don't know what you'd want to call them, because it has, from its initial form, a sort of it's in a way it has parallels to Bitcoin. You can create a nothing that takes on value because it in and of itself becomes a commodity. In this sense, it becomes a bit of power because you've got this little narrative thing going that if you can sell it, you generate revenue. It's part of the macro global New World economy. Most people don't even notice what's going on, but there it is. So this economy has to do with attention span is one, and then information gathering on individuals another, that can be sold, and then it has a way of being also an alternative reality event. So it's sort of like an advanced form of Dungeons and Dragons, I guess. It only lacks very much depth in terms of its true mythology, because it morphed along with the Pizzagate, this conspiracy at the time of Trump, to come into focus as a propaganda machine against the Democratic Party, and that Trump was a sort of savior that was going to, that was working with, actually even with Mueller, but that Q knew was working to get rid of these pedophiles. And that would help save the world of pedophiles. And so all the talk about whether these people were good or not had to do with Trump saying, well, pedophilia, should get rid of it. Which is sort of like asking a stupid question to ask. Mr. President. Mm-hmm.
Well, as much as I'd love to keep going deep into conspiracies, I want to get...
The thing is that they all have a certain amateurishness about them. I mean, I could give you my little book as a primer on how to deal with them. You can't argue them. You can't argue them away, and you can't. But you can analyze them if you're interested. But they tend to morph, and this one's a particularly virulent morpher because it is tied to something that hasn't happened yet. Ones in the past, like the 911 buildings being destroyed by the CIA, or John F. Kennedy being shot by the mafia or something. I mean, that's so far in the past, we're not going to dig all that up again, probably. Although we can still connect it, but it's not like fresh. This one hasn't happened. The coming storm. That ties into biblical prophecy. So it appeals to certain evangelical minds because they read their Bible and they will look for signs. And so if you can take a bunch of stuff that sometimes look like Q is just typing all over the keyboard, all over this thing, and people are making up out of it what they want, they're doing what's called amorphia, which is finding patterns and randomness. You can you can see Rorschachs everywhere. I mean, artists do it all the time. It's not a new stunt to us, but for some people that's kind of frightening. There are patterns. There's a design. Well, I mean, that's what religions are on, that superstition, on that level of imagination and magic, you create religion.
Yeah, and so are some extreme political ideologies as well. Just all this, a lot of stuff.
It's theocratic too, see, because it wants to merge the religion with the secular. See, Trumpism is more oriented. We'll see. He may just brand it and use it as a way to make money by sending money. Exactly. He says he's a scam artist. He'll invent some bullshit thing to get out of jail free once again. And if not, well, he's old for orange. he looks orange. Anyway, I'm not gonna worry about that. Want me to do something else? Talk about politics. Politics is in everything, and there's no way out of it. It's just whether you can handle it or not with any sense of like what the narrative is. Mm-hmm. I'm an old Democratic hack. I mean, I grew up in an era where we did all this before once, but not quite in the same way. We did not intend to kill the senators. We wanted to, but we stayed in the park, and they looked down on us, those in the National Convention in '68. And they said we weren't worth listening to. All we were saying is stop the war in Vietnam. That's all we wanted. Just stop the war in Vietnam. Don't carry it on another term. We don't want to see our brothers going to war and coming back in body bags. Where the news showed the body bags every day, and the soldiers went off every day. And and people were going down on where trains were taking troops and trying to stop the trains. It was serious BLM sort of stuff. I mean, if you want to bring it forward, stop that. You can't be shooting people like that.
Did you burn your draft card?
Huh?
Did you?
Oh, I was, well, I sailed through like on, what did bone spurs? No. I was too old to begin with. Actually, I was born before the First World War. I was born in 41 before the Second World War began. So I was just on the edge of that other generation. So that when they started taking 18-year-olds, I was 21. I was married. I was in school. And then I was crazy, and they didn't want to have to deal with the crazy. I mean, because I had actual papers of, this is not a candidate for the military. So, but I didn't have to go through any examinations or anything. It was just there, clear as day on the paper. I think I asked my probation officer. He said, forget it. Send somebody else. So somebody died for me. Yeah, I admit.
So what on your bio, you have at least 2 bios I found on some pages. What made you curious about the so-called beatniks, the beat generation? What was it about that?
Yeah, I was a beatnik walk-in, they call it. You had to, in my sense, you had to see where the beatniks were. There was we had 2 big newspapers, three newspapers. There was a San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and the Oakland Tribune. 3 of the big Bay Area papers. If you think, I mean, you got to think of Berkeley. You got to think of Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco is this little hub in the center with the bridges, and it's all together, but it's all kind of different. And so, it's San Francisco, 50s. There's in San Francisco, which has the whole history of the Barbary Coast. It has its own way back pirate bullshit thing going on, and it's all these hotels and all this fancy shit. It's a culture, but it takes second place. It's the little apple to the big apple. I don't know. Does that resonate at all? The big apple being New York. So much of poetry has to do with publishing houses. The publishing houses are on the East. And still are, but are on the East Coast. The big ones. There's lots of little publishing. So publishing is a big part of how poetry makes it into and alternative literature makes it into print in a day where you don't have computers. So it's a much older technology and much slower and much more expensive and so forth. The other day, we should make this all this piece is a homage to Cats and Jambers. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. It sounds like nonsense words. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Do you know Lawrence Ferlinghetti? Have you heard?
I actually don't know what that is.
Sounds Italian. Lawrence. I don't want to make it French. Lawrence. He's an American, Lawrence, but his last name is Ferlinghetti. Ferriling. TTI. Write him down and put it. He just died at 101. So he more or less invented the beatnik, or he was responsible for beatniks. Do you have paper there?
Yeah.
Right, Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
Oh, it's done.
Huh? Okay. So he had been trained after the war. These guys had come back from the war. A lot of them, they were interested in literature, and he created a bookstore called City Lights. Now, bookstores have their own lineages. The famous City Lights was a bookstore that was in Paris in the 20s, where James Joyce and Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and E.E. Cummings and the great poets of the early modern period hung out in this bookstore called City Lights. City Lights also means, well, actually, that was Shakespeare and Company, but City Lights references a movie by Charlie Chaplin of Paris. So you associate City Lights with Paris of that era. So they're already metaphors, but if you've tuned into the literary scene that much, which was a literary scene, it wasn't rock and roll, was connected to jazz. Jazz was very involved in it, but not the folk music scene. Not any Hank Williams or Bob Dylan or Pete Seeger and all that stuff. It was cool jazz that came from that had developed on the West Coast, with occasional hot jazz from the East Coast or Kansas City or something coming, and clubs that were small because all the big bands had disappeared. So you had a culture of jazz musicians and poets, and they would play and read together. And it became kind of a phenomenon because you go into a cellar and there'd be little espresso machines, and especially in the North Beach was an Italian neighborhood. And it was on the north end of town, but to the south of it was Chinatown. So you had a big, huge block of Chinese presence in San Francisco. It was huge. And then City of Lights was like a block or two or three. It involved some shops that popped up. And there was a street that cut across it that had strip clubs, right? That added to the dimension. So all the things like the blind lemon, the blind olive, and places like where Lenny Bruce and all the stand-up comedians created scandals, and there were all these clubs that were speaking, Mort Saul, I don't know. They were all big stand-up comedians of their time. And some of them getting busted for some of the shit they were saying. Lenny Bruce is famous, for being hauled off, for saying, fuck you, cop. It was rude, right? Anyway, it messed with people's heads. Then there were these beatniks. Now, these writers on the East Coast that had started to get famous, Jack Kerouac wrote On the Road. He hadn't yet been on TV or anything, but he'd written a book. And he'd written a couple before that, Dharma Bums especially, where they got in a car with a guy named Dean Moriarty, and then they all drove around looking for Dean Moriarty's lost father. So they go to Louisiana, they find tracks, they go to Kansas City, they come down to Santa Fe, they go up to Reno, they come down to San Francisco, and they drive down into Florida, and they come up the East Coast, and they come back around. And Dean Moriarty was a speed freak that could drive those big old 50s Hudson Hornets, and shit, which were like big metal bombs. They get up 120, but they get maybe 130. So you're going to cross these vast spaces with fucking maniac poets, right? Free associating on methadone and pot and peyote and you could survive being in the car for a little while, or you couldn't with them.
Sounds very overstimulating.
Yeah, right. It was overstimulating.
Especially with peyote or cannabis or whatever.
Right. Well, not all the time, all as much, everything right. Day in and day out over long periods of time, right? And that was kind of raw data for things that were not yet happening, basically not for the drugs, but for the fact that these guys were poets that didn't go off yet to other places, but were looking at America as a place where there were Ginsberg says, visionary Indians that were visionary Indians. Only because he'd never been out of New York, so you suddenly stop from Oklahoma. You might actually have a vision of an Indian. It might actually be an Indian.
I actually just, I didn't, this clearly shows my adequacy at research, but is there a connection, is there a connection between the beat movement, I guess you could call it, and the transcendental writers like Emerson and Thoreau?
I guess
because you were just saying
a lot of the research that has to be done to make all that make sense to another generation hasn't even been done. But in and of itself, yeah, because they read transcendental type writers. They were into the Eastern philosophy. One of the earlier books that Kerouac wrote was about a guy named, his name is Jeffrey Ryder. On the Road has more to do with Dean Moriarty, that's the speaker. But Jeffrey Ryder's a different guy. Jack followed these guys and tried to write their stories. So this guy was from the Northwest, and he came down and was in San Francisco and had shipped out on a tramp steamer and then gone to Japan and sat with a Zen Roshi and then taken it married so that he could stay. And then took Joanne Kiger, his wife, and they went to India and they wrote all these, poetry and bullshit. And then they came back and all that got published sort of in the underground on the West Coast in the small presses that we all have. I mean, I'm part of that tradition of the small presses. That's how we survive in print because the East Coast isn't printing us. Other than collected poems. There's an earlier version. Here's the first 40 years. And it's taller companion. Now these are a bit of a hype, actually. I mean, one of the things is that because I'm a small publisher, what I do is I make little books of the poems and I make a lot of copies of them. And then I collect the collections together and make this series up here of collected collections, small collections.
Mm-hmm.
But I did never have any place to put all the individual poems together, like in order, in sequence, not in the little books, because I'd always created the little books were how I created them. I mean, it was backwards. It's called, I call it writing into the book rather than writing on a piece of paper and putting it in the drawer. I just keep making a book and it changes and it moves around, but it's always within an edited context of it becoming a book. So a lot of the things that determine what's there and how they're going to be have to do with when the book is finished, when it's a book. So sequences and all that are all part of the process or worked out internally rather than trying to do it externally and then fit it into a book. Cuts through a lot of time if you're your own publisher poet. Well, I wanted them done, so the only way to really do it is to have somebody else do it. So that's kind of like a self-publishing thing. When they first showed, hey, we have a machine that just takes these and throws them out, pumps them out, and we've got a collection. It's pretty rough technology, but people have improved it over the last 20 years. I mean, so there's a whole world of self-publishing.
Right.
There always was. I mean, poets have always done that. I mean, there was no poetry.
It's probably the easiest time to be self-published, but also the most difficult because now it's so easy to do that more people can do it. Same with the internet.
Dilemmas. Do you want fame? Do you want me? I settle for having a few readers and a few collections, which brings us back to why I created that authors collection, was to show the range of some of my work in relationship to my peers. So it's, in a way, I'm already, even because I'm very near the end, I want to already be there before I get there so that I'm there when I'm there. Mm-hmm. So, why would I create a legacy, that's already a categorized tomb of myself before I'm dead?
And people like me can
right.
People like me can find it on a dusty shelf.
Go look.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there is that. It's a bit of an ego trip in its way, but that's true in the Western tradition of literary types. I mean, nobody wants to be left. The whole Homeric tradition has to do, I want my name in the book. I mean, I want my name on the book. I mean, I want my name to be the guy that wrote the book. Hesiod, Before that, the muses always had it. And then eventually there was a person that had it. Now it's kind of obscene, but everybody's trying to maintain their identity as a writer. But people do. They go to book fairs and they advertise on YouTube. I don't know if that's can you edit that out?
No editing. That's my rule.
It's one of my sides of me in terms of my philosophical sense of my identity that's tied to the older poet that decided not to be the chemist physicist, but to be a poet, which had repercussions because it meant that everything else was under that, which meant that I didn't have a career that was very clear that was going to take me there. I mean, I don't know, what do poets do?
Yeah.
What the fuck is poetry when you think about it?
Let's talk about that a bit. Why? What was it about poetry?
Oh, it was okay. I mean, these things often, in terms of explanation, I've already rethought this a number of times, so I'm always kind of looking at it, but I always want to see it afresh. I connect it to a poem that I read in my English 101 class where there was some poetry. And it was a poem called To His Coy Mistress. To His Coy Mistress. Right. And I think it was a sonnet by Wyatt. So I couldn't figure it out. It baffled me. I have a fair sense of, I do some geometry. I'm interested in mathematics. I'm interested in various things. What is this thing? And so I needed help, and I met a guy his name was Ernest Blank. Sometimes wonder if Blank isn't the perfect name. Anyway, he helped me parse out what a lot of the allusions in this were. He took an interest in me. I was a young, kind of handsome young kid, and this sort of older guy, and he was probably lonely too, but also he was concerned. I looked like I was fucking up. It looks like I was coming apart at the seams, which I always have that demeanor. I mean, he misread it to the degree, oh, well, no, I've been fucking up like this forever, right? But he took me under his wing. But he took me to things like, I went and heard Wojciech, and I heard Transfigured, all these kinds of wild atonal music things at the Cal Music School, and all the way to Beethoven's Ninth and choral stuff. And
So
little
it
chamber
took you to
orchestra.
concerts?
Pablo Casals was teaching master classes, so there's like a whole lot of really interesting stuff going on once you were freed from the tethers of having to go to classes. So I just abandoned the classes. I can ask, is that wise? No. Yes and no. Here I am. No, none the wiser, but certainly with different stories to tell.
So this was when you were like, this was your undergraduate. What would be your undergraduate degree at Berkeley,
Berkeley.
right?
Berkeley.
And poetry just
just
did something.
Some because of the sort of frustration of not being able to get it in terms of understand it. Even though I had been studying Latin, and we did read a lot of Latin poetry because I was going to be a doctor, so I'd been studying Latin. But I hadn't been reading Latin for the same reason. I was looking for medical terms. And so suddenly I started, this is all Latin. I didn't mean that I was a great linguist, but I suddenly could start to read this stuff. And then I just needed some historical fill-in. It didn't help, I mean, you got to know, that you cannot seek me because I am, someone. I am his hind. I mean, it's an allegory about deer, but she is the Queen of England, and Wyatt should not be courting her. And he does. So there's this historical reality that's connected to the elusive qualities of his pursuit that don't really work out very well for him. Which is when you're going to begin to be a poet, you might take as a warning. In my case, I should probably look at that. It's like I should not pursue the king's wife, the third one, Anne Boleyn. Well, but there's all the romance of it. The whole fucking thing is just like a whole world of chivalry and, knights and poets and funny outfits and Shakespeare coming on. Shakespeare, right? They hadn't had any real theater in the old place. I mean, they did a little Commedia dell'arte, and they had these fucking morality plays left over. I mean, I guess they kind of had a Protestant Revolution, but the only drama they had in the church up to then was morality plays. And so there was no theater, there was no action, there was no, so they kind of took Greek models and brought them forth, and there'd been a little here, Racine in France, there was some staging and stuff, and so suddenly they had this way to express themselves that nobody had ever had before. And people could go and sway. I mean, the Globe Theater and all those other theaters, they all had this sort of sensuousness. I mean, of course, the church hated that. You're rubbing up against women and smells and drinking and farting and yelling lines at people. And God knows what's going on in there. I mean, it sounds atrocious. And in 1 week, you know, maybe they shut it down, and then everybody's grumbling. The whole fucking city's uptight because it's the fucking theater. And oddly enough, the king, who's a Catholic, enjoys it too. You know, and his daughter, his what was she, his niece? Yeah, his niece or something. Elizabeth had liked it too, and so there's been about 60, 70 years of it. Shakespeare's gone all the way from the histories, you know. He'd rewritten the history for them, and then he moved on to his disturbed characters that are so relevant. You know, we need Hamlet, we need Macbeth,
Yeah.
we need Othello, we need Henry V. We'll allow him. Well, Henry IV, not Henry V. Henry IV, Part 1. Yeah, we have a few of those guys that have to go through real psychological purgation, so we can really see what's going on. I mean, in our brains, right? I mean, you can't be just making horseshoes all day long, and there's got to be more to your reflective mind than that.
Yeah, that seems a little along the lines of psychoanalysis, or the goals of it, to just further explore what's really going on in the human mind in the midst of...
That frighten us to death that are in our dreams and our nightmares and our anxieties, none of which seem to be real. I mean, in terms of suffering, in the sense that, you know, like I'm dying from what do you call it? Anemia, right? So I got all this stress on my body. Well, that's a natural process. I mean, I can't complain about that. But I had 4 years of just fretting myself to death over Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Could have saved myself some grief, but no. I get caught up in, well, it all involved different projects too, because I was going to school. So that my shift has been more towards seeing myself as a body with organs, and then that shows me that I've reached a different stage than just being an old guy. I've moved into an old geezer. And that's okay too, but it's a little different perspective, because, you know, you don't have the same horizon. It's a different horizon that you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I mean, what can be accomplished and what I can see I can accomplish. Mm-hmm. So that takes a little, you have to process it.
So I also read you would going back to like the beatniks, and
Yeah.
So would you say you were of the beat generation?
Like to, I mean, without there being ego. And I'm sorry I get rambling away. You can always pull me back.
Oh, I know who I'm talking to.
The thing is that, okay, so it's a funny story, and actually it's very seminal. I was an Oakland high school student, and we got this book was circulating around in the thing called Howl, which was a poem by Allen Ginsberg. It's a very important piece. It changed the whole dimension of poetry in the fucking world. So that book was it was uncensored, and so all the words like fucking cunt and shit and piss and stuff were right there in the poem. And that poem was readable, but this was a raving maniac's poem. I say the best minds of my generation destroyed, stark raving nation, naked in the angry streets, looking for a hungry fix. I mean, coming at you at full force like a fucking freight train for long, right? Well, Farrell and Getty wanted to publish it. He heard it. They read it at a little gallery that was called the Gallery 6, I think. And there were supposed to be 6 poets, but only 5 showed up. So Ginsberg was one. And the rest are important. Snyder's another one. But so Farrell and Getty published that and became a bestseller. And it circulated, but it created a legal problem with the words. And so suddenly there was court issues, and all this got wrapped up in it because we were fucking reading this book and we were just getting off on it.
Yeah, loving it.
Yeah, it was just like, well, this is not the Methodist Church perspective. It's certainly not the John Bircher perspective in various ways that we had been brought up. But we didn't connect it to North Beach is the place that's called North Beach. Why? I still haven't found out. I think it's in the north, but it's not a beach. But I hung out with surfers. I mean, this may sound strange, but my path was through California surfing.
Wow.
It's a big thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, aren't the great movies and narratives around California
Yeah, yeah.
surfing?
It's a thing.
It's a whole other culture, right? Well, it just happened to be the crew I were mostly friends with in high school surf. And we'd go up to Stinson Beach, which is just on the other side. And it's not, we're not in Southern California, we're in Northern California, and the waters are colder. And not anybody is as rigorous as the Southern Californians on the endless summer thing. Northern California, you try to pick your days where the waves are good and it's not fucking frigid. And so, but it is outside of the bay, which the bay creates this whole other environment. It's like the Mediterranean. You got to get away from that. It's fucking whack. So you got to go north away or go south down to Santa Cruz or someplace. But so we thought North Beach probably was a beach. We didn't know it was a bookstore hangout for bars and strip joints and places where poets read with jazz musicians in basements, and we didn't connect that at all.
When did you realize what it was?
Well, I think somebody finally on one of our cruising trips in our old 52 Chevys, we were driving around in San Francisco, and somebody said, let's go up to North Beach, and we didn't know where it was. We said, we look where we can't find it. It's the only thing we know. So, because there were lots of prostitutes and young girls and all kinds of shit going on, and people in black with berets, and people put paint on their clothes. And I don't know if you know the Keane paintings. They were a set of paintings of these girls with really big waif-like eyes that were just they were the top-selling fucking painting in the world. And there was a gallery there that had these. And so if you had a date and you wanted to go up there and, go in a little coffee bar and have a little espresso with a bunch of weird stuff happening up here, and then go over and go to the Keane gallery and give her a little book called Twink, which was another of these little square books that looked like Howl, but was in totally a little charming intellectual head joke thing. And all the girls loved that. So we did that. But then it got sort of serious when I got into college, because I met this woman I married that's birthday is today, Patricia. She was a little older than me, and she was really into the scene. And once on my trips, I saw her in a print shop, and the beams happened, right? So beaming going on, and so the whole sense of being an artist changed for me, because I had more of a sense of it as an artistic experience. She was into painting and music, so she turned me on to Wagner.
Oh boy.
Well, where else to begin?
Right. It's
Webern is a little too early. I tried Webern and Wojciech, I don't know, maybe that is Wagnerian, but so she was into the whole Nibelung, the Tristan and Isolde, and the chord that never ends, or whatever it's called.
Yeah. That's music where I'm not interested in the content, but the music for me is, I listen to it and I'm like, well, can't argue with that.
Oh,
Like the
well, I admit I had this poetry, this Renaissance poetry thing going, so I got really involved in the literature of it, and studied the Volsunga saga, which is the Nordic myths, because then I could connect this to other things that I knew, which was tied into the Greek myths. Why, and there's similarities, or a whole bunch of debates around that, but you can do a lot of research on the nature of cross-cultural similarities and symbologies and so forth.
Were you doing this stuff on your own, or were you doing it?
Yeah, that's what happened. So another thing is that if I had have just been what later be known as, I had have just slacked off. No, there were 2 or 3 other guys that were having also difficulties, and one in particular who was maintaining, and we decided to do study groups, and we but we had different agendas. And so my thing was I had this thing where I wanted to read something as far as I could carry it until it found me a reference and then go off another way. So I had a lot of half-finished books or third-finished books.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
I sympathize.
It has its own symmetries that seem to bring you back around, because the thing is that world is not all that big. Finally, it's only 84,000 libraries, so don't worry about it. But it takes a long time to get through all the A's, all the books today. But if you just read the A's, just making jokes. So in that sense, I mean, also sitting around in coffee houses with people that were further read in the books and were more interested and had things to say, in a time when there weren't a lot of coffee houses. There were just 3 or 4 in the whole Bay Area. And basically just 2 that were really center spots. So if you wanted to go late at night, you might even be sitting with a nuclear physicist who would be telling you about pions and bosons and the revolutions of quark theory. And he's the guy that made it. I mean, he's the guy that created it.
So you never knew who you were going to run into at these places?
No. It's a lot, and so many of those types that they suddenly start talking in 3 different languages to 3 different people that were with them, and you suddenly felt like, well, I'm not really a part of this conversation, even though they come back and talk to you. Right? They're interesting for some level.
That's so interesting.
You could communicate. And then just plenty of crazies that are like QAnon shamans. They're kind of they're a blank slate. So don't worry about those guys. I mean, that's hippies and that's everybody's, and kind of can fall into that mode and be sort of shaped by their environment. There were the shamans, and there were the pirates, and there were the cowboys, and everybody had roles they played in the sort of the milieu of the circus, which would extend up and down the street and would draw customers to it. So the business owners promoted it so that people would stop and park and come in and mingle with the group. That were starting to take on identity because more people were coming down. So maybe initially you had mostly bohemian artists, and then Ginsberg and those guys kind of made it famous by reading their poems and hanging out for a while and living in the neighborhood. Then they went off to India or someplace, and other people came looking for them, and there were lookalikes. So you never know, maybe we were talking about Ginsberg. First time I didn't think I was, but I was. So the problem would be then, how much of this is just sort of a weird thing on its own? And it was starting to happen in Berkeley too, because the youngers were coming and they couldn't quite enter that scene. It started to be a little highbrow a little bit because those clubs were expensive and you couldn't do too much. So the younger, and then the shift in the music from the jazz to the rock and roll. This is more like mid-60s. So you have a gap there between like a 1960 and 1965, very fraught with civil unrest, Black Lives Matter sort of stuff in Vietnam. It was civil rights. It was like, so.
You're talking like 50s, 60s, around like the time.
65 is a funny area. In terms of the transition of things from beatniks to hippies and the counterculture, what the counterculture started to be. Initially, it had to do with actually, it was just reporters. I brought it up earlier. The San Francisco Chronicle, there were 2 reporters. One's name was Ralph Gleason. He was a jazz reporter. And another one was named Herb Cain. They seem like minor names now, but in the time they had a lot of audience. We were talking real early media, so it's like, they only had newspapers, and then you had certain columns. And so you had followed columns. And so you would get the flavor of the city through them, where there was cool club, when there was something happening, where there's this, that, and another thing, and both for sophisticates and for artists. I mean, it was like really written for everybody. So it was a nice milieu of writing, and everybody in great style, and you enjoyed it. And so, well, I don't know who first called it beatnik, but it was the time of the Sputnik, right? Because the Sputnik was shot, and we were in this arms race suddenly. The Nick part of it was the Russian thing. And everybody hated these bohemian types wandering around smoking pot and bongoing bongos and reading poems and papers. So they call them beatniks. Well, the beat comes out of a funny thing that Jack Kerouac said about Gary Snyder, was that there was beat poetry. Beat meant beat down, but it also meant beatific. Beat out, beat beyond, transcendental.
Didn't know about that latter part of the
Well,
word.
that's the sort of the hidden myth. This is a part of it. Not to think of it as the hobo, but this is a wandering Dharma bum who's beat, meaning he's been tracking on the Dharma path for a long time. So he's tired. It's not like he's beyond extension. He's beat, but he's also awakened. So he's in this. So this concept was interesting to Kerouac, who wanted to see if he could embody it. So he wrote a book about it. And then he and a couple of the friends of this guy went up into the mountains, up by Mount Baker, and they lived in the summer in a watchtowers, the days when people looked for fires. And they kept journals. And they published those. And we all followed it with bated breath. I mean, all of us by then were like tuned into the beatniks, right? Meaning these beat generations. We weren't so interested in the painters and the musicians and stuff. The jazz did its thing. The painters, oh yeah, they're great. I knew Bruce O'Connor, I mean, once. I saw him walking down the steps there. So anyway, but the writers we followed, they were older than us. They were 10 years older. Most of them born about 28. Along with that generation of jazz musicians like Miles Davis and Horace Silver and Sonny Rollins, and, well, maybe a little later, John Coltrane. That group that were at the end of their phase. There was nobody to replace John Coltrane. What would you replace John Coltrane?
Yeah,
So,
there's nobody.
Jefferson Airplane or something. Jefferson Airplane. Survived. Jefferson Airplane brought us down to San Francisco. In San Francisco. Not to New York. It wasn't Lou Reed. And he had Grace Slick, right? And she could intone. And then you had, can't forget Janis Joplin. And suddenly you had music. We were tired of sitting in those little clubs drinking ginger ales anyway. There was no dance you could dance. Just try. It went off to the colleges and got popular up here. I think it was a very famous jazz school back in some old days. And then, then acid hit, and that I suppose it was only a small atom bomb, but it seemed to spread things around a little.
Did you ever meet any of these big shot or not big shots? Not right. Did you ever meet any of these like celebrities type beatnik people?
Oh, yeah, okay. So they didn't die. Meeting them was only a matter of going to where they were, which you could do if you knew where they were at some time. For me, the first place that I saw a lot of them together would be in Berkeley, on the university, at a gathering called the Berkeley Poetry Conference in 1965. Just so that there's a factual place there, because there is a record of all this. And kind of a bunch of scholarship that goes around the Berkeley Poetry Conference. It had followed another poetry conference that was held in Vancouver, Washington. So these things are sort of like, the idea of conferences was kind of new to poetry. The idea is you get bunches of important poets together. American poetry is very regional, and basically they're antagonism. So you've got different schools of criticism going on at the same time in different regions, the Southern schools and the Southern California schools and the Bay Area schools and the San Francisco Renaissance and the Berkeley Renaissance and the Pacific Northwest and I don't know. It's a thing, and it has to do with how literature is, in this kind of literature, poetry, who's the big shots. Well, some of them had been big shots more or less in this underground world, but not so much major. Since the way back, like this guy Charles Olson, he was a friend of Ezra Pound. He was probably born in 1905, 6, 7. No, Pound was from the 1890s, but Olson is probably born in the first decade of the 20th century. And he'd mentored many people. He was kind of stationed in the East Coast, and he became a part of he became the rector, meaning the person in charge of a school that became known as the Black Mountain School. Black Mountain. And Black Mountain is a place in Northern Carolina, up in the mountains. Nothing fancy, but a place where people like John Cage and David Tudor and Michael Rothenberg and some of the abstract expressionist painters and some of the poets from the West. And they all went down there and studied under Olson. This was just little known stuff because nobody pays any attention, but they paid attention. It's all well documented, and there's great letters and whole bodies of information and developing theories of poetry. They were creating poetics, modern poetics, that were going to make, that are as dramatic as things like Webern and Schumburg, that shift things. You have poets like, So things go off in a lot of different cattywampus ways, and one of the areas connected to philosophies and so forth was the development of what's known as language poetry. So we had an entire, it's almost like a negative poetry. It's like you have poetry, language poetry on top of it, or that actually takes on some strength as a movement because it takes over the English departments. If you own the English departments, you've got half the revolution won. Because the only other side is the street poets, or the people that are sort of independent little Emily Dickinsons in their attics. There's no organization of anarchist poets. There were no foundations in that. There certainly weren't conventions. So it seemed intriguing to go and listen to somebody like Allen Ginsberg and Charles Olson and Robert Duncan and Bob Creeley and Gary Snyder and all in one place, giving workshops and giving stuff for a couple of weeks and reading their poems and hanging out with you, and just partying as much as you were able over a period of 2 weeks. Keep on your feet with poets who aren't known for their, their short hair. They're known for their long hair.
That sounds like that's crazy just to hear about.
Well, it was because I was enrolled at, as is my wont, I follow another destiny that goes back. So I was enrolled at California State Polytechnic, Cal Poly. That's an engineering and agricultural school. So I was in San Luis Obispo, which is a beautiful place, sort of south of Monterey down that way, before you get to the southern Minnesota. And I liked it because there was not a lot of competition in one way. I mean, it wasn't there wasn't any real poetry scene, other than a couple of English professors were interested and tried to get us going. And some of us read some poems in the quad and stuff in the English department areas. But what I did find was a woman, I went to a little seance type thing, the occult, actually, what it did is, I shouldn't do that to it. What I did is I went to a church and I heard a guy read from Milarepa's 100,000 Songs, which is a sacred text, right up there with the Bible. Just the Bible. We don't have a Bible. Right there with the holy books is the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa. And he read it in English. There was no Tibetans around. But it resonated with me quite a lot. I don't know where my interest, I've talked before about many interests and connections to the Tibetans here and there, but this one was kind of special. I would say this one was seminal because they had a meeting later, and a lot of the people that had been there were at this other group, but they wanted to talk other things because they really were a lot of older people that had been involved in the occult arts, not in the negative black magic sense, but they studied theosophy. They were disciples of Madame Blavatsky down the line, through Alice Bailey, through Weatherspoon, and through the Order of the Golden Dawn. There's a whole milieu of people that deal with spiritual matters and paranormal experience and intellectual connections to Tibetan ascended masters and stuff, if you study it. Otherwise, it's just something in the closet. But I studied it, so I went and I met this girl and just had a heartthrob. So it was just the same old story. Jampa seduced by a bikini. So well, without going into, one doesn't kiss and tell, so one just goes on with life. But I did pick up a lot of knowledge about this occult world that was beyond my particular interest in Tibetan stuff. And then, so I didn't encounter Tibetan stuff again for quite a while. Instead, this poetry conference came up, and I took the opportunity to do what I'd done before at Cal. I talked to all my, or I did better. I talked to my professors and asked them what they would do to give me a C rather than an F if I, since I couldn't withdraw, what I could turn in, because I wanted to go there. And all of them, I had 3 professors, all of them were quite accepting of that. I think they understood the pressure. One of them even gave me an introduction to Robert Creeley, which is a big honor in its way. He had been there when Creeley was at Harvard. So Creeley's a significant poet. In that year or two, he'd already had the major selling book of poetry in the country. Something like 40,000 volumes for poetry is outrageous. So he was a hot potato. And others that were there. Olson was a sad old sack, sorry to say. I mean, nobody attains great immortality necessarily just by being long and enduring. Even if you do sound like Homer. I mean, this guy could do the Homer. I mean, if you know poetry, I mean, he's doing dithyrambic breath things. The fucking lines are 18 syllables long. You got to be highly involved with the old schools to do that shit. That's where music comes from. That's underlined. Those laments and those odes and those growls and those resonances. So those, I mean, not to demean music. The poets and the musicians have their arguments or little debates. So I went and I sat in on those guys, and they let me read with them and at places, and I read, and they seemed to like it. I don't remember anybody doing anything astounding, but I felt like I came out of there a poet, more in the sense of this was what I do. Mm-hmm. But I needed to make a living. But I know, I asked 2 important people, Gary Snyder, who's the poet from the Northwest, and Allen Ginsberg. So there's 2 important celebrities besides Robert Creeley and Charles Olson, which are all those East Coast what do you call them? Black Mountain School. Those are those guys. So I got the 2 from the East Coast that are connected more to the Beat generation would be Gary Snyder, the Dharma bum, and Allen Ginsberg, the Howl poet. And I asked Gary Snyder, he asked me what I was doing. I said I was getting ready to go to Alaska to make money as a fisherman so I could come back to Berkeley and start a bookstore. And he said, well, that's interesting. He says, but Berkeley has too many bookstores, or more than enough. You need to go take your idea of a Berkeley bookstore and take it someplace that doesn't have one. Out in the hinterland. I don't think you use that word, but out there in the vast unwashed tribes of Utah, Montana, Nevada, anywhere out there. Even Eastern Washington. Eastern Washington's part of that, right? The Great Basin of Emptiness. So I thought, okay, I put that in the back of my thought pattern. And then I asked Allen Ginsberg in the same party, as I remember, so I got a lot of transmission for the effort. I said, Allen, can I be a good businessman? And should I be a good businessman and a bad poet, or a good poet and a bad businessman? Somehow I had a dialectic going that it couldn't be both, or either. But it was sort of like, well, I'll have to sacrifice my art to be a good businessman, or somehow, because I'm a poet, I won't finish trying to be a good businessman. So, which way should I go? I mean, I don't know. Young people can ask stupid questions. I don't know. Just be good. Good. It had a different meaning, the word good. I was using it kind of like evaluate. No, be good. Well, okay. I haven't been a very good person. In some ways, I'm a very selfish person. I'm following my own little poetry path, just kind of leaving chaos behind me. An ex-wife, an abandoned child, a family that did disown me, a fucking police record, fucking in the fucking nut house. My sanity taken away by the state and the various other criminal charges that were brought by other political actions. My future is probably hanging in the balance. Oh, I could have got a little further, and I know I could. Another round with a straitjacket, I always say. I'm being silly. It is insane thinking. That's schizophrenic thinking. So instead, I got straight listening to the two poets. I thought they spoke the truth. I took them at the word. What else? Well, at that point, my other system was not the guide, wasn't the North Star. Alaska was the North Star. Well, so I was right to begin with, Alaska. So I landed up there, and I landed on maybe a little early in the Alaska work season. What did I know? I just had a trip to Alaska. I had 5 dakinis chasing me for various violations of their proprieties. I just had to be out of town, and Alaska seemed like a place to chill out. Literally.
Yeah, there are multiple meanings to that, of course, as you found out, I'm sure.
I did what workers do. I mean, I became a worker. I mean, I had been a cannery worker. I think I even had my cannery union card. I'd been at Del Monte, some earlier phase of this, trying to make enough money to live. And so I got in the union and I got into cold storage. But they wanted me to cut my hair, but Berkeley beatniks cutting the hair. That was tense, but I cut it a little bit and they get by with it. But the hair was an issue. I mean, it wasn't like, it doesn't matter one way or the other. The guy, as long as he keeps it clean or something, or trimmed. In those days, it was a fucking political issue. So, but then I had to meld in and fold myself into another culture, which was a Northwest deep freeze, freeze fish world. I don't know how to put it all in one place, where you had to deal with a lot of fish. That wasn't quite what I had in mind when I said I was going to go be a fisherman, but so you get the fish you get. Right? I had to put them into their little freezing compartments and shut the door at 40 degrees below zero, and break them out in the morning and put them in bags and take them upstairs and trim their fins off. And it was warmer up there, only 10 degrees above, which is still frozen, but it isn't freezing. So that was a lot of work.
So that was your gig for a while? That was your job for a while?
I remember that. There were some other things that went on, but that basically was the routine. At the end, I got to make ice, but no, that was the second year. I came back and did it a second year. It wasn't like I was totally turned off by it. Matter of fact, I thought it toughened me up. Gave me some, I had to deal with guys. I mainly had to learn Tumo, how not to be cold. Tumo is a Tibetan word for heat yoga. How do you do heat yoga? So I had to learn a form of Tumo. I mean, there's more direct ways the Tibetans have it. And it was useful later when I studied Tumo. I mean, and so the whole business was good as far as the experience. But I fell in love. You fall in love. Or the zucchini gets in the way. She doesn't. The zucchini appears in a pink dress walking along an old street by the beanery or something. And you see her as a golden angel. She has a skip to her that just seems to make your heart twinkle. So, and you have to know her. Matter of fact, you think you already do know her. You thought, in my case, it's really frightening. I thought she was the woman I'd seen the day before in the grocery store at the end of the aisle. That was incredibly beautiful. That was her mother.
Oh.
I was using by one of the little branch bikinis. But she was more agreeable because as I got to know her, she had been an acid. She'd already been taking acid for a long time. This was pretty early. This is 66, 66. Yeah, because she was connected to the people that did that in a psychology world, and she was married to a guy. So, and I had some supposedly Swedish acid, and she was Swedish, and so I suggested that we take some Swedish acid together.
That was a date.
That was our date. Before Facebook or anything. It was just it was 60s. Well, I did have to take her to, I did take her to coffee and we talked a little bit. But when we walked in, the first thing she did is drop her purse and her birth control pills rolled out. So the ice was pretty broken. And she was finding it kind of boring to be in Ketchikan. So, but she was there for other reasons. I don't want to get, Cherry's dead now, so I have to be careful here. She died last year, lost her to no, not, so anyway, she wanted to go to Berkeley. She'd heard about Berkeley. I wasn't sure I was ready to go back. I think I needed some more money before I could build that bookstore. But she was persuasive. We won't go into, yeah. She was persuasive. So we managed to survive. I caught an eye, ear, nose, throat infection, and she had taken a job as a barmaid, kind of one of the first barmaids in Ketchikan. You had men. And so we had a kind of this whirlwind romance and stuff, and then both got so sort of sick that the doctor said we needed to get out of there. So we went back to work. And we had a little money. I think we had $300-400, which was probably about $1,500 now between us, which was find a room maybe. If you were in a place where they had not so good rooms. Maybe not Ellensburg. Well, it didn't matter. We could afford to live it. And she was wanting to be a bookstore person, so she got a job at Moe's bookstore. So suddenly I had a bookstore. So it was like, she was magic. I went off to Alaska and found an alley, and she came and created a bookstore for me. And that was a whole story in that, because Moe's bookstore is the only surviving bookstore of that whole area, of that era. I mean, he started in 1959. And it's still running. His daughter runs it. And that went through many, many transformations. So it was one of the cornerstones of the whole movement. They're all those bookstores are gone. Shakespeare and Company, Cody's, all of them that had great poetry readings. That whole era. See, bookstores, poetry again is connected to bookstores, connected to publishing, connected to print. And it's a world, it's culture. And you do a lot of little stuff around the sides. You read in art galleries and so forth, and you're always kind of promoting yourself, or not. But you take advantage of it to promote your spoken word art that you do, without claiming to be the greatest writer in the world, hopefully, and write the best books. I mean, you can be obnoxious. Plenty of them are. Well, so it was happy times, and I wasn't writing that much, but was it? Oh, no, I hadn't broken into this stage of where I broke into language poetry for a moment. In this would be 67 or 8. Yeah. But it was after I came back to Alaska the second time and did the whole thing again. I'm a slow learner. But yeah, that's the winter we stayed, and we were going to tear the whole thing down anyway, so we yeah, that whole part of the town was developing, so that was going to go away. And I got a job working for a newspaper, and the newspaper connected me to print again, and the person across the street was a Seventh-day Adventist printer on his own, and I worked for the newspaper. But we talked and exchanged thoughts, and he had an old letter press that was kind of all worn out. He just wanted $25 for it just to haul it out. He probably was that in the lead, because it had 4 or 5 trays of type, mostly big fonts, but worn to hell. Well, I mean, I said, I don't know, I can do something with that. And he gave me a few tips and so forth and so on, and we agreed. Well, I had to develop my own aesthetic. I was living in a little attic, something about as big like your room there, only it came to a peak, and I hung poured up, and then I'd print and I'd hang them up, and I'd print a page a day for a week while I worked at the newspaper. And then on Saturday and Sunday, or on Saturday, I would put it all together and make a book. And I did that as a discipline.
And you went through the whole laborious manual process, right?
Well, my wife wanted me to go further and make the paper. I mean, I had some.
Oh boy.
What I did is that I found in my aesthetic that I tended to have to over ink to compensate for the worn type, and then I would push through the paper to a certain point. So I had to get some Japanese rice paper and learn to print these little animal totems. I mean, and so there were things that had to do with like here's like deer on the beach or something, and just a little thing about the moon and a bell. And it was kind of 1969, I think. So we had this sex thing going on, and just little visions and various things. Male cat, semicolon, female cats, exclamation points. Going through. I don't know. It was sort of silly, but it was allowing me to sort of form words onto a page in some way, which had become difficult because of the elusive nature of what poetry is and which part of it you emphasize, really. So I took the imagist idea further than normal. What it shows on the page rather than the sound or the meaning. I mean, you have to bring them together somehow in the word. So I just was exploring a way to find a voice or to make books. So I started making these little books. Well, the only thing you do when you make a bunch of them, I was kind of exuberant. I made like 100 of them at a time. So there were several hundred books I'd made in a couple 3-year period. And even got some credit up at the University of Alaska for making one. And I studied printing, and I kind of got interested in art and so forth a little bit more. But the idea of the printing the little books, I kind of laid that aside. And then I went into philosophy. And then my mind circulated more in terms of learning both Western and Eastern philosophy. I hadn't studied either in depth. And so I studied under a group of what would be called language analysts. I had studied, and I was being introduced to continental philosophy, which is more metaphysical. And then I was studying Indian philosophy from a guy that had spent time with ashrams in India, but also with a PhD. And also, I hadn't studied Tibetan yet, but I was getting the background. But I also was trying to look at the West to see what's going on here. So you have some parallels, some problems arise immediately because of culture, but one of the big ones in my interpretation from reading Immanuel Kant was that you can't know what you know until you know how you know it. Sounds simple, but think about it. It's not simple at all. So if everything you think you know, you ask, how do I know that? Can you give a suitable answer to everything?
Yeah. I haven't read a lot of Kant, Immanuel Kant, but does he talk about, I'm sure there's plenty of
Oh yeah, he talks about
writings.
everything. But I mean, you have to see that it's in this transcendental world that he's choosing pure reason to explain it. So he's not letting you have much information that's concrete, like pictures. It's like pure reason and logic. So it takes a developed taste to understand Kant. What I just said is just his language. That's what you would have to know what you know is how you know what you know. I mean, there's no picture there. And then if you say, well, what is that a picture of? Well, I mean, is it a thing? Well, if you say yes, it's like an apple. Well, Kant would say, how do you know that? And can you say you know the thing in itself? I mean, all you know are all this stuff on the outside. I mean, coming at you, perceptions, ideas, and shit. So what's the thing in itself? So there's no knowing the thing in itself. I mean, he agrees. At that point, you can begin to say, well, what can I know? Well, he sets up a dozen different categories and various schemata so that you can sort through quantity, quality, depth of field, or time, space. All the ways you know things that are part of how you would check to see what you know. And for the last 200 years, that's basically science, outside of some of them. I mean, but in terms of neurology and brain science and all that, trying to figure out how we know what we know. And we're not very far along in a verifiable ways. And so it throws a lot of the thing is, well, what about the East? Don't they have some solutions to this? I mean, this is philosophical. I mean, if you're thinking about it, so the philosophical side, well, let's look at this other side. What do they have? And there's a whole world of information tied to the history of China, India, Tibet, the Nordic tribes, the Siberians, the Indians, that have been discussing all this, and along the lines of, coming up with answers of whatever. And then there's the Greeks. The Greeks are just this strange thing. Well, but they are. That's sort of like, wait, this is not that kind of thinking. This is shifting. It's connected to how these people want to live together. I mean, they're not going to live under some tyranny. People want out of that. They want freedom. That's where these big words. They want liberty.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I've always found
some explanation of how those things are even possible if you don't buy into this whole other system. So they're problematic because you've got then a couple thousand years of this science reason situation going on, mostly where people are using their reason to make schemata to create the structure of things, but they're not free. I mean, they're using their imagination and their understanding in a certain way, and maybe I'm just repeating myself. And they can just not do the imaginative part while they end the reasoning part and do the awareness part.
right.
Right.
The awareness part. So this is all. So you went up to Southeast Alaska, then you went back down to Berkeley, then you went back up. And the second time you went up, was that when you were up there for a longer period?
Well, yeah, that was. Then I made a shot at it. I mean, in a way, some of it again was cultural, political stuff going on in Berkeley. There was a liberation of People's Park, and there was a shooting, a guy died, and then there was more intensely tear gassing and various things going on in the streets, and it seemed like. And Sherry was pregnant. I didn't know. I wanted to raise my first child in the streets of Berkeley, throwing tear gas at the kids.
How old were you around this time?
Oh, by then I was 24, so I should have known better. Well, I didn't know better. I said, no, I'm getting out of here before getting's good. And it got shitty after that, too. So then there was that. I think People's Park happened right after where a guy got shot. So as much as I appreciate People's Park, I mean, this one that we call People's Park down here is named after that. People still use that term.
Oh.
Yeah, the one that's Kerry Lake now, but in my time, early on, it was before they put in all the Irene Newhart driveways and things. It just was a raw hole. We went up and swam. Well, so then I had to be serious about raising a son because you're on another level. Responsibility. These are funny words, but you hear them a lot. So I had to get a reasonable job. In Alaska, it's better to be indoor. I thought. I did quite a lot of finagling to get into a good indoor job where I was learning to run a 3-unit gloss press, those great big presses, and I was burning plates and going out taking photographs. And I had my own column, and I'd wander down along the waterfront, and I'd interview not sailors, but fishermen type people and cold storage owners and ask them how the fish were and and write up this thing. And if I saw something strange, like a pretty girl that was doing some surveying, I'd do a photo portrait of her and get it on the front page. Followed a whole sea otter trip where we took sea otters out and stuff. So I was doing all this wide range kind of reporting, which was good because I still didn't really know how to write. That was a good training ground.
You mean
I was out of, I don't know, you can say I had problems, but I had bad problems being able to write a fucking sentence before I went nuts, and then afterwards it was just, I had to start from some scratch. I think that's where these image things were, is I needed an ABC inside the language, or I couldn't move the language.
Yeah. And by writing, you mean like more conventional writing?
Yeah, like what we used to call journalism.
Just
yeah,
what we used to call it.
Yeah, it's like this is a day in the life of Ketchikan, and this girl belongs to the United States Survey Station, and they're making a survey bee because they're going to tear down this cold storage plant where I used to work, so that they can knock that part of the hillside out and make a straight road along the front waterfront. I mean, that's my story, right? And this is a project that's projected to be taking a year and a half and something. Her name is da-da-da-da-da. And if I couldn't ask her out for coffee because I was married and had a kid, but I flirted with her. I mean, I'm a terrible flirt. So and she was just businesslike and went on in her surveying world, looking for horizons. I mean, everybody has their horizons. So at that time, I had a pretty good horizon. I was on the swing up. Then I came around the corner in those little towns. Have you been in Ketchikan? You know how it's laid out? Ketchikan?
I actually don't know how I've never been to Ketchikan.
All right. So it's a waterfront town with a street that goes down to the village, and then it has some inlets and things. And so there's all these old buildings, and it's probably changed in the last 30 years since I was there, but all the same, it's an old frontier fisherman's town. And they're little shops because it's a touristy place. It's the first stop on the way into Alaska, called the Gateway, even though it's on an island, but so that's the way it goes. And there's a beachcomber shop. And I saw a book called How to Live on the Woods on $10 a Week.
Right.
By Bradford Angiers, who was a Canadian, lived in Canada, because Ketchikan is just a little piece of land outside of Canada. And he had a whole scenario on how you can live on $10 a week in the woods if you're careful. I might have read the book a little quicker than I should have, but I got enthusiastic about the idea. Now, this one's a hard one to sell. I mean, we need a nice cushy job inside of a shop that actually is a trade that has futures. And the old guy that's running the presses is going to retire soon. So you need to bring your mind into focus about what, as much as a loser as you've been to this point, from various adult perspectives, telling people I was going to take their daughter out into this 25 miles from the nearest roadhead without a boat. Presented somewhat of a formidable obstacle. Although, oddly enough, I don't know, I never knew. I think they just allowed us to do whatever the fuck we decided we'd want to do. That whole family's Swedish socialist types that are very independent, and the women are strong. They kind of got behind it, some way or another. So we got some perks. I mean, we managed, with the last of my unemployment insurance, I could extend it and I get about $80 a month because I couldn't find work. So I worked the system a little. In the sense that I was way out there, and all I just said is I looked for work, fill out a form, and I got a little pittance, but it was some, when you're doing $10 a week, $80 is $20 for a week. Save money on unemployment insurance. I read Henry David Thoreau. Do you know his work? He's one of the great.
Yeah, Walden. I haven't read Walden yet, but.
Okay, but read the chapter on economy. He has a whole thing on how many bean rows you need and how many nails you need to do anything. And he's got it all down to a few, I think he spends $28 a year. So the sense of economy is inherent in how you have to live in that kind of world, because you've got to take advantage of everything that's there. So that's a challenge, and that was part of the excitement of it. And I think also Cherry liked the idea of it because she got her away from her mother. Her mother was heavy-handed in many ways, controlling. And she could ride along and do her knitting. You asked about me making paper. She wanted to make everything, like have sheep and make yarns and spin them and dye them and the whole thing. So we were the first of those generations of, let's go back to the land and do it all from scratch. As raised in the city. She was raised in Seattle and I was raised in Oakland. So even though some of us, I had some farm experience, and I had been a gentleman, had a ranch. My dad had a ranch, so I had horses, and so I knew a little, the English aristocracy level, American aristocracy. I had those talents. You learn a lot learning to handle a horse. There's a whole fucking world of knowledge in handling a horse. People don't know it. You can breed horses. Anyway, so we got friends together and helped, and we all put together supplies, and we followed it out as much as we could to what we would need. And on a sunny day in the middle of December, where there was no wind blowing 40 miles an hour and hadn't been snow for quite a while, and I'd gone out already in a plane and landed and rode over and looked and tried to make an inventory and stuff. We flew out. We took some boats with some friends and went out there. Dropped us off. The tides there are like 14 feet, so it's like the tide was up. So we just got stepped off onto the dock and put our supply. It was showy. I mean, there was a couple foot of snow on the roof, and there was snow all around, but it was like a nice sunny day. But the kids were already complaining about being cold, and we had to figure out if we could get the stove working. It was an oil drum stove, and of course, and I had checked it, and the stovepipe was fucked, and so I brought a new stovepipe. So I had to get a stovepipe up and get things cooking. Trying to get it cooking while I was putting the stovepipe up is not a good idea. Trying to build a fire without a flame, and what we did, we got this thing up and got our hands warm. We ate some sandwiches and some coffee and stuff, and it was, Alaska doesn't stay right very long in December, so they wanted to get back to town, which was like a 20-minute speedboat trip to one point. And there we were, with the hoot of a scoot, fucking nature, yeah, quiet.
So it was just you. Oh yeah, quiet as fuck.
Yeah, baby Theo could walk, but he still wasn't toilet trained. So
just you three out there.
Yeah.
It was just you three out there.
Yeah, okay. Then there's some little variations. There's a cabin, so it's on a little, what they call a little bay, off of a big bay. So there's Mosier Lake, and then there's a deep bay, and the deep bay, I think, is on the other side. So this is a little cove, of which there's two cabins. One that nobody lives in, and one that a hunter lives in, but you probably wouldn't see. So you'd see him in the fall. He might come out if the weather doesn't, not living there. And then a mile across the open water was this lake. That there was another cabin. There were several cabins, but only one family, and it was an old folks that settled in there and retired from their days of being fishermen. And they'd made a living of sports fishing, enough fish to retire. And now they were living on unemployment and fish skins or whatever. And it was good to see them, but I mean, he was as conservative as Archie Bunker. Does that name? I mean, have you ever heard that phrase? Archie Bunker. I mean, there's just certain figures that are so conservative that were TV personalities. That just think of this guy. So, and we're still hot in the middle of Vietnam, and we're still hot in the middle of Black Rights. We're still hot about gays. Gays are not so talked about. They're really, but the blacks and the civil unrest is still a big issue, especially Vietnam. And, oh God, so you can wind up in a lot of politics. and in a little cabin that's not very bigger than your room, and she's making cowboy coffee on the stove, you know, where you take boiled water, throw the coffee into it, and let it boil a little bit, and then splash some cold water on it, and then pour it off so without getting grounds in it, and maybe you drink 14 cups of that together.
I'll have to look into
Waiting
that.
for the airplane, waiting for the mail plane. Yeah, you got it. The reason you go there is because the mail plane lands there once a week when the weather allows. And since I didn't have a radio or anything, I had no idea if it was or not. I just assumed that if it wasn't just a fucking storm going on, there was maybe mail. And I had a little dinghy by then with a 5-horsepower engine that I could putt. But man, Alaska winters in a dinghy. You know, I mean, I don't know what I was thinking. I literally, I mean, the dakinis held me, God held me in his hands all the way across the whole fucking experience. I could have drowned a million times. Well, 1,000 times, easy. I could have gone. There's no getting back to shore out in the middle of a half a mile of fucking Alaska waters. So, you get swimming out of there. So, you got about 2 minutes. Maybe a little more. So I just went over there and got the mail and came back, bringing home the mail. I'm the mail. This is a big part of the whole story, of course. I'm the mail, you're the woman, we have the child, we have home, we're in the woods. You know, I mean, you can work this one to death. I go out and I hunt the deer and I bring it back, and you chop it up, I chop it up, and you cook it for. And you keep the sourdough warm, and you put it together and make bread and bake, and then we go out and gather berries, and we teach our son to gather fern fronds, which are kind of like they taste like one of those little cabbages. They're good. And so you start exploring, and you understand there are mushrooms and kinds of grasses that are edible. And she was just nuts on that stuff. So we were eating sour grass, wild asparagus, and fucking blueberries that are coming out of our ass, and venison, which hasn't got any fat in it. So man, they gotta get some fiber in with that shit. Anyway, it was an experience. It was in the middle of the winter, and we weren't there for very long before that fucking hit us so cold and hard. I don't know why I ever thought I'd go. I remember that first night. All of a sudden, we'd just fallen asleep. There was this huge grating sound, and then a ka-thump, or a bigger splash, and then fucking water literally came into the house. And Sherry woke up. She said, "An avalanche!" And I think I said, "No, it's a tidal wave." And it's just a big chunk of snow falling off. But it always seemed to me to punctuate the moment for the first night. Right? It was always going to be a fucking, if it wasn't an avalanche, it was going to be a tornado. It was very apparent if you lived in the woods. And you had to cut wood, and you had to haul water. Very zen. But you had to struggle a little bit to do it. But the fishing was great. I love fishing. And the crabbing, the clams. And we had bounty. Yeah, we had bounty. And people sent us espresso, and they sent us powdered milk so we can, make breads. And Gary got really adept. And, we got a lot of canned stuff. We had some vegetable type, certain seasons, part of the natural thing, but you had to have stuff through the winter. We learned to kipper salmon and canned stuff. And there was always an emergency. That was a chinook. Fucking deer is rotting. Like, they had to get this cut up, and we had an old Coleman stove, and we out there. The thing when it hardly worked, you had to keep pumping to keep the pressure up so you get the meat. So you felt pretty primitive. It wasn't like you didn't feel like you were earning your keep on floating on some I'm off the grid utopian thing. A lot of people, that's what they think. They're going to go up there and it's all going to take care of itself or something.
But you got to work. That's what you're saying.
But not 8 hours or 10 a day. Do that. Sometimes more, sometimes less. A lot, no. half hour. If you do Dzogchen, you don't do anything.
Right.
But then you'll be sitting there doing nothing, and you look out, and there's a fucking big log that floated off the log jam there. And if you don't go out there and rope it and pull it in, and get it up high so that when the tide goes out, you can get in there and chuck it up into some blocks, and then string the blocks together so when the tide comes back and lifts them, you can pull them up higher. That saved you a fucking month of work, right there,
Yeah.
right? But you got to be on top of it, or in those ways. I mean, so that's where the Indian sort of thing came into me. I probably had some drugs and stuff. Anyway, I felt natural at it. From the Dzogchen point, it's like, just being constantly present and aware. And then I wrote my poetry and allowed my imagination to get into these artistic realms. And Sherry knitted. Theo grew up and learned to be a kid. And we did that for almost 2 years. I think our parents were by then getting desperate. Thought maybe we just So I got offers to go back to college. Not that in Alaska that takes much of me. But I don't know, my dad had gone to the extra trouble of tracking down all my grades and probably negotiating. He wanted to come to Alaska. He was almost 70 years old by then. He was 69, 70. Yeah, he was 70 years old. But he was still spry. And so he got my mom into come up there and help him. And so we just had to drive between Ketchikan and go on to the mainland and drive up to Fairbanks across the Alcan, which I don't know that it's ever been a great highway. I don't think it's much changed from what I hear. I mean, it's just a big gravel road that goes across the Yukon. And everything drives on it.
Everything.
And so you just have to dodge the boulders and the huge wind and the slow Winnebagos. And I had started off with a brand new engine, and I had stored it. So I had it rebuilt, and then I drove it. I took it on the ferry up to Haines, and then I started off towards what they call the cutoff to get back into Canada. And I got just over the border into Canada, and the engine blew.
Oh shit.
Right. So I walked back. I don't know how far it was, about 5 miles. I remember giving Cherry a 30-06 and saying, you're just, this thing's loaded. If this bear sticks its head in his face. But I walked back and, there's some Seventh-day Adventists. I have a luck with them. I've had several Seventh-day Adventist positive experiences. I don't know anything about the religion, really, but I mean, they've been there like Samaritans, aren't they? I think they're Samaritans, part of that school. And he had a little station, and he said he could help, and he found an engine, and I traded an older engine to a guy for a blown-up engine, because the nearest engine that I could get shipped came from Kentucky and cost $2,000 in those dollars. I have a fucking, like today to be like I build a Ferrari here up in Haines, only it's just a VW. So I said, well, this will run. And I had so much stuff on that car. I mean, I had all the print materials and all the clothes and all the fucking library. I swear, that whole library was that shelf down there definitely has been to Fairbanks and back. So I had books, guns and frying pans and whole fucking thing in a Volkswagen bus, with a little. And so so this thing was over, and so I couldn't get it to really go very forward in fourth gear. But it did all right in 1, 2, and 3. So
was fourth the highest on
I
there?
could drive it in third gear all the way. It's 1,000 miles across the fucking gravel road. But so I wasn't any worse than going back out into the woods for 10 hours. I figured I'd invest in tires and then hope there was another engine along the way. Although there are spaces in those days that were like 300 miles apart. They're fucking massive. Well, I'll make that far. 240, I think, is what it take the whole tank to get there. If you break down. So It was a long, we spent must have been 6 days. So we took our time. We had lots of weird adventures, going slow. I think the only car I passed was a Winnebago pulling off. I
So
did it.
what I've heard the term Winnebago before, but what does that
Oh
mean?
no, it's an Indian. It is an Indian word. I think it has to do with a tribe, but it's attached to these big vehicles. That was actually a brand. That was a
Oh,
recreation vehicle, and its brand was W Winnebago. And then of course they take the W and draw a line. So it was a brand of,
oh.
and it was of that era that was a kind of fancy. So then it becomes a generic term for all those kinds of things. On a
So
fucking
like big home, like motor homes and like
motorhomes.
trailers.
They're really fancy these days. In those days, it was still a new thing that people would buy a big chunk of vehicle that size and then try to drive them in places that Winnebagos weren't designed to go. But they did. So you'd be caught between, say, like a big fucking logging trucks coming down with loads of logs and a fucking Winnebago, and either navigate your way in a little Volkswagen or hardly move in third gear. You've got to be on top of it, mindfulness, or you're fucking gonna wind up in a ditch. I had two flat tires at the same time, but I had two new ones, but they were the wrong sizes. So I had this real problem of everything was out of alignment. It was,
God.
I suppose I could have done better researching my trips. My son like laughs at me. I thought of it kind of like the 30s, the Dust Bowl. I expect I romanticized it a lot. Sherry knitted, and she didn't get it anyway. Make another scarf or another pair of mittens. And chit chat. She knew all about poetry and literature and music. And she's a great chit chatter. I'd like to chit chat forever. I mean, I've learned tons of stuff. She's been trained by the Jesuits. I mean, as a girl, she was a jewel. One, she'd been trained by the Jesuits, and she'd taken more acid than anybody in Berkeley. I mean, she'd been taking it longer, but anyway. And so she could rhyme this up and take a bunch of us and take us on a trip because, she'd know what coffee house and where good to sit and where to find the right bench and how to subdue demons. And she came from that Leary tradition. She wasn't she was learning the West Coast, and this is important if we're in that psychedelic thing. Is the East Coast had these scientists that wanted to study it as science, and they connected it to the Tibetan philosophy, so it had transcendental overtones, Jung and all that. But the West Coast didn't come that way. It grew up from the psychedelic music and the fucking Dionysian,
Yeah.
revelry, orgy sort of side of it. Ken Kesey and the flowered bus and all those things that didn't have anything to do with tune in, turn on, drop out. It was like by the time that arrived, everybody was sort of dropped out.
They were. They didn't need to hear that yet because they had already
Well, like,
done it.
that was maybe meant something back east. Well, because all this is, everybody had read their William Blake. Well, not everybody, but I mean, among the intellectuals, William Blake, you know him. William
Yeah,
Blake, English
bit.
poet, illuminary poet, mystic poet, political poet, big time, really. Actually, was involved in the American Revolution. Was a part of the underground that hid Tom Paine in England. He had all these visionary ideas about not using your reason to tap into your demonic energies, which were your true creative genius. I mean, he was saying that in 1787. So it's like, he started to make sense in 1960. I mean, he didn't make sense through the century that followed him because nobody wanted that kind of unification of polarities, male and female equal, good and bad equal, transcending all polarities and dialectics into a great vision of the New Jerusalem. He had to get a little behind his kind of Christianity, but it was his original Christianity. And it didn't include your reason, which was the sort of the demon. Your reason being all this rational stuff around science. He'd prefer you got So anyway, that whole body of energy, along with a lot of other radical thinking, the Grateful Dead being the real thinkers, meaning the music scene took the lead as thinking. they may sound sad, but basically they were doing it because they were writing the songs. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the narrative. So they were creating the narrative. And then poets followed in there. You know, we had Gary Snyder and Ginsberg that continued. They didn't stop. Sounded like Jack Kerouac just couldn't handle this new generation. He went back and lived with his mother and continued to drink himself to death. But Ginsberg followed over, or what came, and Gary did, tried to teach the young. And Ginsberg more because he got so involved in the anti-Vietnam stuff, so he had a whole hippie entourage, which was fortunate because the hippies didn't become QAnon shamans. They could have well become the QAnon.
Oh yeah, they could have.
They had not read Marx. They had not read anything. They had flowers in their hair. They believed in free love, peace, slogans, that the Marxist slogans. And they had helpers that tried to help them, assist them, like we had the diggers, various people that created free clinics and free this and free that, free food in the park, free this, you know, and trying to make a culture out of the remnants of sort of like, well, these people just wandering in and out of nowhere. There used to be some happen we called the beats, but this is not the beats. That was not the beats. They were younger, and so those that were beats would say, wait, I'm not dressed right. I've got a black turtleneck t-shirt. Not with it. I couldn't make the full transition into a paisley shirt and flared jeans. I decided I'd dress more like a blues brother, so I got a black suit and some counting boots, because the Beatles were in there too. See, the Beatles were actually cool. Oh, well, they seemed cool because they taught us to dance. I couldn't dance to Elvis. And I couldn't yet quite dance to the Grateful Dead, which has a lot of swaying and reforming and where do you fit your partner into all that? I mean, that's all mystical stuff. But the little steps that we used to connect with, say, the twist and the jitterbug and all these various dances you once learned, you could finally find a little standardized set of things so you could dance with girls at parties. And the Beatles had these tunes that you could hear and understand. Dylan wasn't quite so present yet. He upset us in Berkeley because he wasn't pure. In Berkeley, we'd listen to Vivaldi or Manfredini or somebody before we would listen to fucking Dylan. We would listen to maybe Pete Seeger, but normally we were more interested in somebody like, if we were into the blues, we wanted Mance Lispin or Leadville or somebody. We wanted something down those paths that was authentic. We listened to that. That was important. Joan Baez and Peter Paul and Mary sort of softened it a little bit, but Joan Baez and Bob Dylan starting to come together added a new flavor of popularity to our little Beatles mix that took us over psychologically. Because on acid, and you go down and you buy Highway 66 Revisited, and it's the first time you've heard it, and you have all this shit coming down, it sounded like God was talking from the mountain. I mean, not sure why. And you didn't want to really think that Bob Dylan was God, but he was actually the muse. We won't go that far. He was the muse. And we played, and that was kind of, he liked that. He was a song and dance man. He didn't want to be a prophet. So, but it changed the dynamic scene in terms of our cultural narrative, brought us together more, which I know we've lost in the last 30 years or more. So there seemed like there was actually a counterculture because it had its music, it had its dance, it had its art, it had its poetry. It had these posters everywhere written in weird language that you had to be kind of you had to know how to read that stuff. It was in bikini language. And all it was just distorted letters and stuff. But you could see it, that it would say something like the 11th floor elevator was going to play at the Fillmore for $2. Next week. It wasn't
Sounds
too hard. It wasn't intellectual. We were not revisiting John Paul Sartre, or we were not existentialists exactly. They weren't. I unfortunately had already been tarred by John Paul Sartre. I wasn't existentialist. I mean, in the sense that I saw that as philosophy. I mean, I wasn't seeing psychedelia yet as philosophy. I don't know. I didn't think that tune in, turn on, drop out was the fundamental basis for which a metaphysics could be created. I might change. I'm changing. I may change my mind. So I mean, again, being a philosopher, I mean, I already had studied all these philosophers. And in a very strict analytical tradition, I mean, I was an analyzer. And I would take these new ideas and I'd analyze them to see if they worked. And I would cross-compare through different things. So I already, with a bachelor's degree, I finally was given one in 72. 74. I could tell my dad I had completed this odyssey from 1960 to 1970. So it took me 12 years to get a bachelor's degree in philosophy and poetry. Mm-hmm. And by then he could care less, I think. I mean, he was glad that he did. I wasn't on his payroll anymore. He wasn't bailing me out of jail. That I had a kid and that I had a family and somehow I was making it. I mean, he didn't understand it. I hadn't proclaimed Buddhism. I had proclaimed business acumen. But he didn't see small businesses as real. He was a big business. There's a split there between people. They don't like the risk of a little business, or they fear the risk. They like a company where you get promotions and raises and stuff. In the old school, that's maybe this has gone away. But that company that he worked for was very orthodox that way. You got in, you did all these things, and you got all this stuff all the way up through retirement and insurance options too. You insure everything, and it all comes out at the end. You get retirement. I mean, in a real way, real in the sense of in a common way that Americans think of retirement. I mean, I suppose it means living somewhat the same lifestyle that you were living while you were making the money to live in the house that you live in and maintain it. Without necessarily a big income, because it's always reduced. Oh, I mean, that's all economics, household economics. And I was still struggling to keep just my household going with a kid and family and starting a small business. And so I had to kind of be more on top of the idea that I'm an entrepreneur and that I've got to do something that's going to make money with this box. I got to put merchandise in here. I didn't go to business school. I got a book on dynamics of business and a bookkeeping system. They didn't have computers, and so it could all be done. And I just decided to be straight arrow. I had studied with Cherry, with Mo, and I understood a system on how to sell books, how to buy and sell books, because I'd done a 2-year apprenticeship with Mo. He's the greatest bookseller of all time, in my opinion. But one of the greats, definitely one of the greats. No one would deny Mo's status as one of the great entrepreneurs and booksellers. He's the only one left. So, I mean, I had a way of appraising books so that I could find profits in all kinds of books and assemble used books. And then I also bought gifts, and it seemed like I found things that people liked. And so I'd find everything from Guatemalan bags to Afghani jewelry or something, and little firecracker things that pop up, and crystals and knickknacks and kites. I just fill this little space up with every goddamn imaginable thing that you can get in there. And then about Thanksgiving, I just let people go in there and I think made a profit. So I just kept saying, okay, I need more merchandise. Now I'm going to do this, add this, add that. Move next door and then move back and take this. And, it became the business wars of how you grow a business. Without thinking too much about, is this making enough money for me and my long-term goals to retire? It was more like, can I get all these bills paid? And usually by the spring, I couldn't. I'd extended my inventory. I had great inventory. But I didn't have the money to pay the tax, which I hadn't saved, which I should have, but I didn't. It was part of my one. But it's hard when you have that money at hand because it was hard to get credit in those days. So I'd go off and plant trees. I'd give it to one of my girlfriends by then to run. She'd make coffee and sell things at whatever rates. I'd mark everything so it was in. And then I'd go off to Mount Baker and join a co-op of people and a group of people. And we'd plant in the woods for a month, making much better money. I'd make all the money I needed to make the tax payment and some. So I would then start the year off with a really good inventory. And it's all in the inventory. The inventory is, that's the point, inventory. So you have to have that. You can't, oh yeah, Bob Hope, somebody said, when he was young, he was selling newspapers in New York, and a big limousine pulled up, and the guy reached out and gave him a $5 bill and asked for paper, and he said, I didn't have change. And the guy leaned out, and it was John D. Rockefeller. He says, the two things you need is always to have inventory on hand and change. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you can't make a transaction. If you can't break a 5 in the 30, a kid selling newspapers for 2 cents trying to break a $5 bill and he hadn't made that money all year long. Well,
nowadays that's a lot less. Change just means less and less now.
Yeah, but it was a good knowledge for Bob Hope, who became a great businessman besides being a funny actor. But I mean, he was one of the great Hollywood businessmen of his era. So it's all interesting how you learn lessons from various places that save you trouble. And the bookstore lasted, 25 years, I guess, really. In a way, it was an institution, and I kind of am proud of that, and people still reference it. People of my generation that remember it. It was a hangout for them in an era where there wasn't as much sociality, social being. It was a different town. Still had lots of things that would be like an old town, a theater, a laundromat, laundries, stores for men's stores, and different kinds of businesses that, a shoe store, things that, we don't see that here anymore. All that was absorbed by the malls. It just, that era came late here. And what came late also with that was that the hippies hadn't arrived. The beatniks hadn't come. I mean, if you want to make the connection. The beatniks had not arrived here in Central. Trying to make Ellensburg special again. This is why it's a ley line. So, in terms of my generation arriving and meeting some people that had been going to college, and there were some interesting teachers up there that really promoted getting to know your students. It's the 70s, and so you had a different milieu of teachers and sort of a cultural thing going, this countercultural thing. And so there was a lot of interaction between different groups, and anthropologists getting together with musicians, getting together, and then street people that are not necessarily in the college, but had maybe gone to college and starting businesses and deciding to get married and stay. And we all sort of would have these big potlucks. And so then maybe it was 50 of us. It was like a little conclave of hippies. But 50 is a lot. We get together every week or so. We had even our own restaurant, more or less, a place that's now the Wild Blueberry. That was called the Outrageous Taco. Mike Burton, he'd make these tacos that were this big. They were like $1.40, and so you could fucking feed the family on a taco. And I don't know, it was maybe an exaggeration, but he kind of opened up the restaurant, and after the business hour, we'd all dance and play music and be artists. And we had three places like that. We had one up at the Palace where we could go up and play music and dance. We had one called the Labor Temple Dance Collective, which were a group of dancers that had a space down on 3rd Street, a studio, so we could go there. So we have parties and food and drink and smoke and be beatniks, bohemians, whatever, artists. There isn't much distinction. I think the idea that Herb Cain decided that these people walking around like that were beatniks, it was the same thing he did with the hippies. He said, these people are hippies. Well, we didn't think of it as that's us. We appropriated it because it was, you didn't want to say, oh, well, I'm not a hippie. Of course, it's just, we would think of ourselves as freaks.
Embracing the freakishness, too.
Yeah, embracing the freak. So if you were a freak, you recognize another freak. It's like Buddha. Buddha recognizes Buddha. A freak recognizes freak. Oh, that's a freak. And he had to be just not a weird, it's not a visual thing. It has to do with people with very unique ideas that put together enough information that you can carry on a fairly intelligent conversation about the world. And that want to get together and dance and make love. a lot of, the free love thing was maybe a little overboard, but there was some of that. And it's still there. I think kids don't talk about it as though it were a cultural issue. I don't know what to do. But I mean, we shared a lot of partners before they married and got straight. So a lot of us got married and got straight. And stayed and ran businesses. I was more of a playboy. But then I got pregnant again. And had another wife. And it was at a time when I needed to make more money. And she was very much make more money. Motivating. So I expanded the business again. Well, that's what business is. You need more money.
Well, just check up by you're here. You're in Ellensburg.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I had
Okay.
followed Gary Snyder. I had found a place that needed the bookstore and a place out in the hinterlands that was feeding it, that was making it live. So it seemed prophetic, or it seemed like, okay, then this is so I am, rather than being, what are you? I'm a student. I'm looking for the truth. I was Richard Denner, bookseller. Sometimes they say that's bookseller, cards, and tea. That's Richard bookstore, cards, and tea. Because I sold cards and tea. And the whole coffee thing. See, I started the first little coffee house that was a coffee house. It wasn't just an espresso bar. Greg had one then, but I had one that was just a bookstore coffee house. So I had one of the old school Berkeley coffee houses. Only similarity would be maybe the one in Seattle called, it was a bookstore, big bookstore coffee house. So there was those. Then it became, people stopped and it became famous in the sense that people would stop again and people would come and say I was sent because I heard you were here. A couple movie star types, once in a while. I'm going to make a big splash if they were in the Berkeley bookstore in Ellensburg. Jan Kerouac, which was Jack Kerouac's daughter, lived here then, kind of for a while, but she was recovering from some dialysis, and then she wrote a book called Baby Driver, which was imitative of her. So she launched her career as a post-beat under the name of Jack Kerouac in the 80s. And we used the bookstore to help her in any way that we could, make her feel at home, that there was still a culture. So she'd had a hard life, living in Jack's shadow.
I'm sure that was a weird life to live. I was actually, before this, I was watching an interview. Actually, it was a roundtable discussion on a British show, and Jack Kerouac was there. It must have been like very close to his death because he died in the 70s or the 60s. I can't remember, but
I think 70s. I think that's the year he died. It was at the end of this.
He didn't seem like a particularly happy person in the.
Well, who could? As a Buddhist, I know you can't judge people, and you can't really even make an evaluation of any sort. We imagine somehow writers should come out happy, or we also imagine that they should have some style in passing from life to life. He's of an old school of writers, and a lot of them, that's the way they lived and died.
Yeah.
And so there's not that that's okay, but he was not happy apparently with the fame game that seemed to be coming his way in terms of being. He was from Canada, and he was from northern Connecticut, and I think he was a little primitive, might not be the word, but he was a little shy. He was more of an investigative type of reporter with a lot really incredible blown out style. So he wanted to witness. He wasn't going to, so he was a great witness. He created these characters that lived bigger than life, that were also real characters, real humans, and that had real careers and real people. So somebody asked me not too long ago, were you in those books? No, I mean, that's another generation. I mean, guys that were my age were just babies. whenever we were young, we were in our teens, when those guys were very famous. And they were famous for very strange reasons that aren't something you can reproduce, that somehow you just knew the right key to become famous. There was a lot connected to the kind of psychedelia that had to do with the Time magazine, which is still a big issue. Time magazine, Time Warner, that sort of thing. We were talking conglomerates. There was a Time magazine in its day, and the owner of that was interested in beatniks. And he also produced a book called Life magazine, which is a big coffee table photograph magazine.
And that's out of commission, right?
Like social media for a lot of people. Both were left and right. I mean, those things were just around. You go in the doctor's office, or you go by somebody's house, and they'd have a coffee table and be putting Life magazine. And they did a big spread on those beats. They became they liked Picasso. They used to do Picasso all the time. So they do these international art celebrities was part of his shtick. They did not the whole book, but he would touch on that a lot. So there was this whole sense that, oh, fuck, Ginsberg, there he is in Havana on a fucking crashed CIA plane going, yippee, with Cuba. And you say, that's my Howl poet, fucking the FBI or the CIA is investigating. So it was like Ginsberg. Oh, there's Ginsberg. There he is in Prague, where they've made him Queen of the May. You know, and they were celebrities of their sort, like Paris Hilton, or I don't know. She doesn't that much, but I always liked Paris Hilton's shit. Britney Spears, and so they had followings, and they still published, and they got famous. They got into those big formal anthologies. And another generation actually liked reading it. Sometimes it doesn't go from generation to generation. We're down 2 generations now. I think it's kind of, most people have had it now. With Ferranghetti dying the other day, don't forget Ferranghetti. I mean, he spanned the whole century with it, right? The whole thing, from the early moderns to the post-moderns. He created an atmosphere, a mise en scène, which allowed all these writers essentially to be mixed. And there were other factors too, but so he represented, they made a street for him next to the bookstore, so there's Ferranghetti Avenue. And, you know, so he celebrated as poet laureate, and the whole thing, it's all very establishment to make you not realize that, of course, beatniks hated the fucking establishment. They wanted to, whether or not they would have rushed the Capitol is a question. Being anarchist poets, they couldn't get organized to get fucking upstairs, right? So it's the same problem with Antifa. It's just an idea. It's not like the beatniks all met together and conspired. They didn't even really knew it.
Yeah, there wasn't a group of beatniks with an established creed. It was a bunch of
they're all really
stuff going on.
Is like Keats, and Ginsberg is like Walt Whitman, and Robert Creeley is like Emily Dickinson, and Robert Duncan sounds like Homer. Charles Olson sounds like Homer. No, they represent all the different areas of poetry. All somehow together, they all wanted to give the finger to. And so the arguments would always like, how political should we be, and all this thing. That was an era where we all had to show our colors as communists or not. That my mother was a secret communist, and somebody stuck some kind of a rod up her ass that made her believe that, you know, that Stalin was controlling the family. That sounds like Ginsberg, you know. It's just like growing up in weird paranoid situations and sort of saying that this is the subject of poetry. We are no longer going to be talking about the red wheelbarrow. You know the red wheelbarrow?
No.
Okay. Here's an example of poetry, also kind of contemporary and not that far away, but it's a classic. So it goes. The red wheelbarrow. That's called Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, drenched in rain beside the white chickens. I think drenched is not right. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, something with rain beside the white chickens. Well, it's a picture, right? doesn't
It's
seem
actually
real
ringing a
political.
bell.
Huh? Well, no,
It's
I'm
actually
not
ringing a
saying,
bell.
can you see the picture? So much depends
Mhm.
upon the red wheelbarrow drenched in rain beside the white chickens. It's supposed to be a poem, an example of poetry. So set against, oh, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed, startling me naked in the angry streets with their hungry fixed. We have this other poem. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow glistening with rain beside the white chickens. So these are worlds apart, poetry-wise. Uh, and the one's more calm and reserved and seems to be drawing a picture of a thing that's an object, two objects that are in relationship to one another. It's sort of like a meditation of the red wheelbarrow. And the other is sort of a bombastic expression of anger and confusion and diabolical energy that's trying to bring down the walls of Jericho and establish some New Jerusalem at the end of an era along communist Buddhist lines. And all because I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed, who was talking about Carl Solomon, who was in a mental institution getting electroshock while he was writing that. And so he was envisioning his friend in the mental institution getting electric shock, and that he wanted to express his view of America. Well, it was a little shocking that anybody could say that. But, well, on the other hand, we still had to deal with the red wheelbarrow. We couldn't all write this fucking crazy stuff, or we could, but I mean, so there's influences how to bring all these threads together in it's like music. I mean, how do we bring the Impressionists, the Debussy, and the Webern with the, I don't know, Scriabin or something like that. I don't compose, but I mean, these are all, after they've become tropes, after they've become like we're dealing with ideas here. So one of the ideas that Olson had was that we need what's called projective verse. That we needed to look at it as a field, like it isn't like all on the page. It's sort of like ongoing. So it had quantum mechanics. It needed a lot of modernization for whatever poetry was going to be. It couldn't be these individual things. It had to somehow come all together so that everything could be there. And so different people went different directions. Again, how do you know what you know? And poets have to invent their language inside the language and then try to communicate so that people understand kind of what they're doing. And so it's an art. It's been going on for a long time. It used to be, part of it was in the old times. I mean, there was plays and they'd have the chorus could say all that, but then it really falls upon the poet to do the whole chorus. You have to do all of it. And so it's easier just to stick to the red wheelbarrow than just to try to encompass America. But I don't know, poets have these jobs that are supposed to be part of their preserve what to be. Poets are sort of irrelevant, other than once in a while that like young girl that spoke at Biden's thing seemed to make quite a show. You know, she was very astute, direct, and spoke in the kind of Blakean fashion, and she was trim and bright like a star. Good poets.
Yeah, if anything, poetry seems to have manifested itself in the modern day in the form of probably hip hop in its most popular way.
Yeah,
Because a lot of the smaller artists really has that feel to it. Painting a picture, painting feelings.
it chose an odd form to do it in, but it chose the form that it chose.
Yeah. I don't listen to a lot of hip hop, but there's some more subtle artists that are really, it's really quite something.
On the other hand, there's a whole body of poetry that doesn't consider that poetry at all. It's all song. And the song is not a part of it. That's song. It's got to have its beats and its music and all that stuff. And it's got to play along those lines. So the poet is something on its own. that's even harder to pin down. Again, because as it's evolved in America, it's regional, very, and there's no center to it. So you go from place to place. Like here, Yakima is a group, they read, and there's a wide variety of types of people, old people that write kind of religious poems and everything. There's all the academics and what they do. I don't know. I mean, it's all. There's the university has created a faculty, created a kind of poetry machine. I mean, that's true of lots of universities. Created music machines, poetry machines, painting machines to help you get a job doing that, so you can make a living doing this thing. So if you complete the program, you get this degree that makes you eligible to teach poetry at the university. And then you need to publish and kind of what they call publish or perish. You've got to stay on top of your poetry too, which is a double difficulty for college professors because they have so many committees they have to attend, and so they certainly their creative side gets diminished. A lot of them are one-shot wonders, one-pony wonders. So, yeah, the coming to Ellensburg was a very fruitious time because there were other things going on as well in painting and in video, in the early technologies and so forth that were exciting to experiment with.
So this was this like 80s?
Yeah, 80s.
You came to Ellensburg?
Yeah, 80s, going through the 80s. There also was a shift in the culture around the nature of what they call New Age. There's that term. And you know what that?
Yeah.
What is it? I get funny answers for New Age. What is that?
I mean, it's one of those very broad. To me, it's one of those broad terms, like counterculture, that just covers such a wide spectrum.
Okay, but among things, what is it covered? I mean, I don't mean to make it fast because somehow you're speaking it long enough. But the term comes out and then something like, I don't know,
Sorry, you're gonna have to repeat all that one more time.
I mean, I don't mean to make it as a test. It's not. It's just that when a term comes out and it means so many things to different people, it doesn't mean anything at all. Or it means even to the person it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
There was a term New Age that had to do with astrology, that kind of New Age, that ties back to the 60s, and this is the dawning of Aquarius. Have you ever heard that expression?
Yeah, I've heard that.
Dawning of the age of Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the dawning of the age of Aquarius represents the beginning of a new age, is what it is. But what does Aquarius have to do with it? Aquarius is a constellation, right? In the sky. Mm-hmm. Aquarius. Have you seen pictures of it? Most people don't spend much time learning their constellations. No reason they should, but still the constellations are there. They say, oh, I look up, I don't see anything. Like a water bear, pouring water on the surface of the ocean while drawing the water back. I don't see that. 2 figures.
Mm-hmm. Anyways, you came to Ellensburg around the time where this sort of new age thing was coming about.
It's not like it's a new thing, but it's a new surgence of interest that seemed to permeate a big group of people, not just in Ellensburg, all over the country.
Yeah.
I don't know what the uncertainties were that would bring them into these forms of knowledge, symbolic forms that have to do with the collective unconscious and that are generally embedded in the sciences known as occult divination.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I've always thought New Age is into like yoga and this specific sounding music and like alternative medicine, crystals, stuff like that. All those things
kind of compile them all together, but in ways that are not just, oh, well, we have a grab bag here. There's reasons they get put there and how they interconnect and how they affect one another in terms of how you talk about it. So the astrology part of it had to do with ancient prophecy. You can take it to the Egyptians or further, but the astrology has to do with the cycles of planets that are moving. And all those cycles have to do with time, because time is, in this sense, measured by rotation. Motion, but basically it's rotations. So that over great periods of time, there are rotations that return, and those become ages and so forth. And one of them, in terms of the relationship to the gods in the past, going to Christ and then going to Osiris and then going into somewhere, those occur at certain points, and those are measured by a cycle of the planet as it If you looked at all of the constellations, and each of them took up 30 degrees, and 30 degrees times 12 makes 360 degrees, you have a circle. So if you divide this 360-degree circle into 12 zones, and you assign them symbolic meanings, you can call them the houses. Okay, each of those houses. These are areas that our activities occurring. And then overlaying this, if you look at it as the sky, there are a group of what are known as wanderers. Those are the planets. I mean, we're talking early astrology, early astronomy here. So we're trying to get our head around certain cycles. And there's different cycles for each of those wanderers. And in those times, there weren't 9, there were only 6, or 5 or 6. And so those cycles were watched, and they were watched by eye, and there was recordings. Early writing is all about this, is that they're adding these cycles together, trying to keep some sense of what the cosmos is doing. And when you look at it at any particular time, what you can divine from that position, logos, latitude, longitude, and temporal territories, that would indicate something. If you were trying to make a decision, it would be a good idea or not, or something in between, to make that decision. Not so much for everybody, but for the king, or the big important people. The king, usually. It was to help him. Okay, so these cycles, one of which is that the sun then goes through all of those 12 cycles over each time 2,000 years. It comes back to itself in a period of 2,280 years, so-called 4,000 years or something. It doesn't go, okay, so, well, actually not that one. What it does is that the position of the planet, where it is in the east at the time of, say, Aries, which is where it is, it would go out in an orbit as far as Vega, which is above us. It takes 22,000 years to reach that. And all those signs would be there, because we go through half the time. And then it would return. So the North Star would be from here to here, over 24,000 years. And that will have completed one cycle of ages. And we have been in the Piscean cycle for 2,200 years, and we're moving into the sign before, the next sign, which is the Aquarius.
Okay.
Which is a 30-degree section of activities, of experience, with the wanderers again. And by this point, since this was old ancient Egyptian stuff, the people wanted their own. So we have 2,000 years, which they unfortunately quit keeping good track of following the same pattern for individuals for 2,000 years, so that you now wind up, you think you're in Aquarius, but you're still in Pisces. So it's a little confusing when you get the astronomy and the astrology together, because they don't align. But this is important in terms of symbols, because in symbols, these things have occurred, and there's already data in terms of how it's codified, so that if you're divining, you use the old texts. You don't get real scientific about it. It's an art. You interpret it by what arises and what relationship to what times. Are the birds flying right across the road, or are they flying left across the road? And is it 3 or is it 5?
Yeah. It's interesting how popular astrology is even now. But so, anyways, that's the whole thing of the New Age. That's the meaning behind.
Starting with one facet of it, which is called astrology, because it's one of the oldest of the divining tools. And it's used throughout the world, it has been for ancient times, through the Egyptian mysteries and the Eleusinian mysteries and the Chinese mysteries and Indian mysteries. All these things have used different systems of astrology, of following these things, to make predictions and so forth. But then behind that, that's a very elaborate system of gods that you have to do. Egyptian gods, you got to do Greek gods, you got to do Tibetan gods, you got to do different Hindu gods. Trying to get all of them doing their stories together is hard, because even though they've influenced one another over millennia, there's still a lot of variation. To know sort of like who, like we have Dionysus. Do you relate to him?
Dionysus.
Dionysus?
Yeah.
He's still struggling to kind of be the god. I mean, it's sort of a complicated thing to become a god in that old pantheon, but it continues of how his rising and so forth continues. The poets follow it, and the occultists follow all this. And it's sort of an interesting world. It's not very useful, and it all kind of confuses people, and they get taken in by charlatans. And so you have this problem of it's magic and it's bullshit. So I don't know what I'm getting there. I mean, numerology is a simpler form where you can just take numbers. And this taps into another part of the brain, which isn't so imaginary, which is the astrology is full of pictures and stories and planets, and it's very elaborate. But numerology just deals with the first 9 numbers and a cipher. And those, through different configurations, which are lots, you can kind of correlate different things. And it appears that the ancients, in creating language, were aware of number as they invented words and letters and so forth, so that there seems uncanny combinations where the numbers and the meanings coincidentally are the same. Especially in sacred texts, say Bible, say Tibetan Book of the Dead, say Egyptian Book of the Dead, say Homer. I haven't tried Homer. But anyway, so those are all there. And they're fascinating to people that do what they call germatia, where they analyze all this. And it was especially popular in the concentration camps among Jewish intellectuals who were famous for what they call the germatia of the Bible. I mean, they had plenty of time on their hands before they were exterminated. Huge fucking contribution to the world of numerological stuff. So they too are a part of the New Age. I mean, then there's all the mystical traditions that by their very nature being transcendental deal with this going on, whether you're doing it in terms of astrology or not, or numerology. I mean, just the fact that there's different cultures with these different paradigms that are going on. So you can do it with, palmistry, so that as above, so below, and the human is the cosmos. I mean, this is an old ancient thing. So you are a mandala, they call atom, the atomic. And so you can read your own lines. And again, it could be kind of like a meditation of trying to discover who you are based upon things that seem at random or do change, but as with age. So all these lines that seem to converge at different points in your life take on significance. And if you study it really closely, you can work it down to the day, or whether or not it's good day to go do anything based upon the pawns of Mars or something like that. Shouldn't be aggressive today. This line is crossing. So, you can do that. All kinds of other auguries, the way birds fly, entrails of sheep, and millions of those sorts of shamanistic stuff that people still connect to. I don't know if people do too much entrail reading these days. They do some things. They're kind of strange. And New Age then connects to these early philosophers in the 19th century. These women, Alexander David Neal, Madame Blavatsky, and a few others, that went off into the East to collect a lot of this data and bring it back to Victorian England. They brought the New Age idea. So it was a science of God that they invented, called the New Age. And Madame Blavatsky had a genius, and she had others that were into it. Crowley, Bailey, all these, there are a lot of them that study all these arts and Celtic lore and various things. They're kind of like early Jungian Argonauts before Jung was born. I mean, that stuff was going on before Jung came along. All he did is tap into a bunch of stuff that already was happening. He just said, oh, fuck, look at all this. Well, I mean, it's all already there. It goes back all the way into the Middle Ages. All the magical potions and magical circles and mandalas and incantations and stuff they do. So he you know, people following Jung would suddenly discover that there was this rule. But they got into this weird place where they thought they were receiving empowerments from transcended masters and higher. This is where it gets a little woo-woo-ish in the sense that if you take the New Age movement and don't look at the great spectrum of it, but sort of the first of the people that were trying to make something out of all this strange information in such a way that they had a message organized. You know, Blavatsky and these people were doing it, and they were in England, and so, you know, and we're talking, so this is, they're in England where they already had been doing mesmerism, which is hypnosis, and electrolysis, because they discovered electricity, and they were doing all these strange experiments with minerals and various alchemical things that had come out. So there's all this sort of half science, half bullshit stuff that's already been there for a long time that had been hidden and kept secret, and, you know, fucking Isaac Newton was doing it, and astrology, and that was all hidden. They hid that. It's called occult. Nobody sees that. Newton's works are still occult. You can't see them. They're hidden for another 100 years. So who knows what he figured out occult-wise. But so this influences people, and so you start having, in the 1920s, you have seances and people with Ouija boards and people meeting up and seeing ghosts together and doing stuff. And other people being real scientific and going and kicking the table over to see if there's something going on. There's nothing going on. And the whole thing gets poo-pooed down all the way through the 50s. You know, no more bending spoons with the mind. All the stage tricks have been exposed. And it sort of stays there, except that there's always something that nobody can find an explanation for, that needs to be measured, that's beyond the normal. And so in nothing else, the scientific use of the paranormal, but the occult, is still alive, because there's still interest in what's happening here. We don't quite fit into our other paradigm. And there's people who take that seriously, and they meet in clubs, and they. And in the 80s, it just seemed like, wow. What was strange was there was a group of the old Bailey people, which were from the turn of the century, the 20s, that were old in their 70s and 80s, that lived in Rosslyn. I mean, I got turned to Alice Bailey. It was really strange because she does a whole esoteric astrology thing. Plus, I met a guy that was becoming a professional astrologer that gave me a little Texas Instrument computer and showed me how to make charts. So, I mean, I started combining these things together so that I could sort of do it. Again, experience is important. Otherwise, you're going to kind of lose 90% of the experience. You don't do it. Mm-hmm. So I would read people's charts. I didn't charge them much. Sometimes it would take me a couple hours to get a chart together. And those old computers were funky. You know, they weren't computers. They were adding machines with numbers and tabs and shit. So punch together a bunch of longitudes and latitudes and adjust for time, Greenwich time and daylight savings, and had to have books and stuff to get it all. It's all on the computer now, but in those days it took a while to assemble it. And then you had to deal with all the different interpretations. And there was enough psychologists around that you could do it through transpersonal psychology and make it sound fairly sensible. It sounded like you were talking to Jung and he was doing your chart. He wasn't going to leave it at the chart. He just, well, what's your sign? You know, and you draw up a chart and look at it. And then in the meantime, he'd ask you your temperature, like a doctor's supposed to, you know. He'd ask you about your family, or he'd ask you about your art, something, you know. So it was mixed into counseling as legitimate, rather than the gypsy way, which was, okay, come in here and, you know, I'm going to read your cards and, you know, cross my palm with silver. And then it cooled down in the 90s. But I sold a lot of books, crystals, tarot cards. There was a teacher here named Chester Keller, who was a PhD in philosophy, that taught a course on mysticism, among whom David Pond was his student, who was getting a master's in what we call experimental metaphysics. And this is where the term metaphysics got used two ways. Metaphysics means what are the answers to the deeper questions, not how do you arrive at them. So New Age metaphysics is the divining stuff. They don't have the answers, but they're trying to get to them. So it's really more like a mental tool to get to something. So it's not speculative in that way, because they already have a system worked up that says that Mars in Aries is pretty aggressive. You're not going to get them to change their mind about Mars and Aries. Mars rules Aries. Mars is Aries, the planet in the house. The Aries is the symbol of spring. It's robust. It's coming out. So all that stuff becomes symbolic in ways of a language to say, if you're worried about that, I would say, well, then you should read your astrology a little more closer. And if not, forget it, because it doesn't probably mean anything that you wouldn't intuitively figure out anyhow if you just made up your mind. People just often like to not have to think. So I studied with these people, and they had lots of exciting ideas, and it was fun. They came down to the coffee house and we bullshit. Go on trips. I remember when Benjamin Cream was this guy that said that the Christ was going to reincarnate. What was that? 1987. Oh, in fucking Seattle. Listen to him talk about the night where all the Tibetan stuff in the Shambhala were assembling so that the Christ could reemerge. Of course, I don't know. There was some bad vibes and it didn't happen. But it did give me a taste of what that end days thing is like. Because there was always things happening around this, like all the ends of this new age. This all seemed to happen. There was the end of the Aztec calendar, the end of the Kalachakra calendar, the end of the, just like all these calendars coming one after another, completing their cycles, that you would sort of think that, okay, so what does that mean? Does it mean anything? And so it's a conspiracy theory mentality. Right? Yeah. And you buy into it as much. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed sort of the ride. But it also meant that I often felt that it was disingenuous and I needed something a little more substantial to follow as a way of life than astrology, read astrology charts. So when I met a Lama that wanted to turn me into a Tibetan yogi, I thought maybe that's the way. So I just started hanging with her and her Sangha. I still think her Sangha. That's 30 years. Nothing's changed. We built a retreat center. We built stupas. We built dance platforms. We built yurts. We built residence halls and stuff. And we brought in lamas from all over the world to talk. People take all kinds of new age stuff. Things related to yoga. Yoga gets mixed in because yoga came early, kind of with the Eastern stuff. And it has its own connections to the Vedanta, which is part of the Hindu tradition, which again is new agey, but it's really old. And most people don't follow. A lot of people that do yoga don't study Vedanta.
You're talking about like Advaita Vedanta? Is that what I'm saying, right? That one's less into metaphysical stuff. Don't they have like I know they have a comprehensive meditation tradition that is akin to like
the Vedanta is the epistemology and the Advaita is the insight. So you've got to do the practices to get the insight. It's a very structured thing. And then there are other paths, the Sangaya Yoga, which is a more wilder yogi path, and there's, the Nanaya Vaisheshika, which are really just the logicians. There's a world of logic. If you're interested in logical, mental stuff, the Hindu logicians. and being an old analyst and studying with some of the Western ones, I mean, like Bertrand Russell and so forth, I mean, I was sort of fascinated by their dialectics. I didn't know, I mean, I kept hearing them say you can't do it with concepts. So, I mean, I didn't just try to study it, I tried to do it too, figuring, okay, I'll study the concepts, do the concepts, and do the practices and see. And now I see why, yeah, you got to do the practices, you can't do it with the concepts. But that doesn't mean the concepts are have some worth, or not, you know. I still enjoy them, these little intricacies of metaphysics. Then, but if you watch a whole, in that sense, I was like moving my life towards a path of the Dharma path, and meeting people on the Dharma path where it's a little more formalized, and submitting to teachings that had structures, and tried to learn it in a systematic way. I did it for a long time without a systematic approach, only because of the conditions of different lamas coming in and just took what I could get. But finally, I found a lama in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, 98. That was a monastic lama that taught from the sutra up to the Dzogchen. And then we like starting over at basic 101. But you would see where 101 led to 102, led to 103. So yeah. Didn't go from 101 to 306 to 490 to 220, which is a hard path of bouncing around a pinball machine. When you do it, what's called long rim, like step by step by step, step by step by step, with somebody that's there all the way through, and gives you the structure of how you're to get from here to there, and sees and talks to you in a way that you understand that you've made it from here to here to here to here to here to here. And that you're receiving the next set of teachings. And it's not a monetary thing per se. I mean, it's, oh, well, I'll pay you to do that. Nobody's buying Dharma. The teacher's got to feel you're a student. You can be a student as a person that pays money. Lots of people do. They like the atmosphere and empowerment. And you can hire on and do Lama work, serve the Lama and so. Or you can practice your butt off. And the Lama makes us happy to become a practitioner. I mean, that kind of practitioner. It's not a free ride, but I mean, it's like, I mean, I did all of it, but I mean, it's sort of like I could see that this is what brightens them up. This is what gives them the energy. This is what gives the Lama the energy. You got a student who's fucking learning this shit, and I'm happy to see you next time that you start to have intimate connections with the experience. One time, this Lama that he was from Tibet, and he hadn't had much exposure to the world at all. He had been trained in Old Tibet, and he taught in all 5 schools, and he was a Dzogchen master. But he was a monk. He had 8,000 monks that he took care of in an area of Tibet where there were 40,000 people. So he was the main man in a big regional spot as far as the man. He was popping into Terramando where there were 5 of us and teaching us the Nidra. We had no idea. It was sort of like having Jerry Garcia come and teach us 4 of us the fundamentals of rock music. We didn't know, right? We didn't really get it, but Lama Tsopan knew, and so it grew. So we had this guy, and he had a sister that was the Dakini Tara. Then he had a cousin that was a ritual master that was into tech, who liked to record everything. So he and I hit it off. So we recorded everything. It was always an excuse for me to get out of a lot of the ritual was to be the recording guy, the tech. Mm-hmm. I had to do something. They all said, Jampa, come here and practice. But I mean, the Dakinis love the practice. They're fanatic to practitioners. So I can hardly stay on the page most of the time. I get my mudras all mixed up, and I know them, and I can do it. I'm supposed to try to be better than I am at it. I am better at it. But me, I like to just I like the ritual atmosphere. So we would record things on video, and I got to then do little ceremonies with them. I became a magician's apprentice. Maybe it's important to see that from a Western point, the Tibetans basically built all of their religion, at least at this Lama level, on exorcism. So we're back to the magic. I mean, we exorcise demons. It has to do with the way it was invented, the way Tibet, how Buddhism came to Tibet. In my particular school, it changed over the years, but in my school, which was the old school, they had problems at the very beginning taming the red-faced cannibals, and so they brought in a monastic, I'm sure to build monasteries, but all the monasteries would get knocked down as soon as they were built, and so they had to bring in an exorcist. And they brought one that's hardly even known in the world at that time, but he came in. He seemed to have been famous over in an area that they still call Shambhala, it would be the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Swat Valley. It's an old Buddhist civilization that had been buried. It's just under the ground, but it's there. It had those big statues the Taliban blew up. That's about the
right. I read about that.
5th century, 6th. There's a big scene over there. So in the 7th century, the King Detsen, who was the king of Tibet, they sent some guys over there to get Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava was part of a lineage of people that had been receiving transmissions from a guy named Jampa Dorje, who had been receiving these transmissions from a cat named Vajrasattva. So these sorts of kind of mystical transmission things that go across time and space, so have to be sort of assumed to be true, or otherwise the story just becomes a mess. Anyway, Padmasambhava had the mojo necessary to come and subjugate the demons in Tibet and build a monastery called Samye. And for that, King Detsen gave him his first wife. Maybe we always say, well, maybe he was talking about his best wife. He gave him Yeshe Sogo, and Yeshe Sogo and Padmasambhava cooked up a storm. It's about 50 disciples, and they did things that are just all miraculous. It's hard to even start to talk about it because it just sounds like those it's just all miracles. I mean, the Tibetans don't do histories of things, they do histories of saints, and so everything is miraculous and everything is tied to these transformation and miracles and things. And so to ask, well, when did this happen and what time was there anybody there to make it a witness? You would never read the literature. But the literature is incredibly rich in these stories. I mean, it's like folktales, it's like Daniel Boone and all that shit. This is on steroids. I mean, fucking thing these saints did from 700 AD to, well, when is the new translation school? 1036, I guess. So up to the middle of the 11th century, those guys were pretty much the main teachings. And they were connected to a bunch of shamans that were in Siberia, and then these people on the west that were Shambhalans, and then the red-faced cannibals that nobody wanted to deal with, who basically are barbarians, I mean, and werewolves. Those are the Tibetan people that were totally uncivilized. They were useful when King Detsen was trying to conquer China. I mean, you take armies of those guys out. They come running down the hill slopes and they caught you, they fucking eat you right there in the spot. So I didn't want to fuck with them. But he got tired of having to deal with a fucking army that had to extend from, say, western Tibet, Afghanistan, all the way to Beijing and all the way north into Siberia and all the way south. That's a big chunk of land. So he figured out another way to do this was to get these lamas to organize things and for him to sell the knowledge to these various other despots. So he formed alliances with the Mongolians first and then later the Manchurians to subjugate China. So they didn't have to deal with the eastern border, which is their weakest link. On the west, they've got the Himalayas, but in the east, there's access. And the Chinese have been coming up there and giving shit for centuries. Well, so that's all geopolitics. There's sort of another area. And actually, it's hard to really pin down because it's still new to research. You know, it's all new areas of looking at Eastern history isn't necessarily the history of all battles and kings. There's all these other things. So the subjugation of this area so that they could maintain.
Hold on a sec. Sorry to interrupt you. I'll be back in 1 second, but then please continue this.
Yeah, because I could go on, and Tibet's got 1,000 years of history there. Should go too. There was an interruption. So we prove to ourselves that we are mortals.
Yeah, we have
Our
bodies.
bodies with organs. I get so into the body without organs that I forget about organs.
So we've been going for quite a while now, and
You want?
I don't.
I'm not, it's not that I'm infinite and not can't become exhausted, but I mean that's a good telling of a lot of tales. If you wanted to revisit it, edit it, and go back and do something else that's more structured or something, fine. Or cut it up in any passion you want and put it in any order that you want. I mean, I've been collaborated with so many times that I don't mind that, like Steve Fisk will just give me white noise and let me say black is death 20 times very loud in the middle of white noise. I'm used to that.
Yeah, but for the sake of our bodies, I think I'll wrap this up soon. But did you want to give any closing thoughts on your whole Tibetan Buddhist experience?
Closures. Other than, well, I've given you a lot of talk about Tibetan Buddhism and poetry and the Beat Generation, and I could fill in more with stories because there's a lot of life there living that. Alaska. So all those are various areas of my life, and I often bring it back to Ellensburg because we're still here. I'm here, and it is important to me. So I'm glad to be here in Ellensburg and have the opportunity to meet you, your audience, and tell you about my life. And blessings. We all beings find happiness in the causes of happiness.
Well, I was happy to have you on because I knew you would do exactly what you did, which was have nothing held back in terms of experiences and information and things learned, and you have quite a history, so it was really nice to have you. And whoever listens to this, I think, will find it very interesting. So you've had quite a life as a beatnik sort of Alaskan fisherman, bookmaking poet, among many other things.
Yeah, it was a life. It had adventure, romance, intrigue, all the elements that make life. I mean, I'm happy with the story of it. I mean, you can evaluate one's life based upon things that you thought you might have done, could have done, if should, what happened. The Buddha was never sure all the forces that make up karma. Karma is something that you develop. You become the karma. So this is where my karma led me. This is where my karma manifests as me. This is more. This is, and I hope there's more of it. I mean, the best of health, but I'm not in the worst. But I'm then almost 80. So that's perfect.
Well, still going strong. So we're happy to have you here as long as you're
Don't do that.
willing to be here.
No, I don't want to be here any longer. Let me out of here. So thanks. Okay.
All right.
Maybe
Well,
when you get
I will
something
let you.
together, let me know.
All right. Yeah. This was very. There's a lot to unpack with what you were saying. So
Maybe if you do
thanks.
editing, it probably would be better if it wasn't 2 hours long. That's a lot. Maybe 2 parts or something. What I'll leave
Well,
it to you and let me know. And then if you just want to talk sometimes, we'll talk. Um, I've still got a time here between the next chemo session, which is in a couple of weeks.
mhm.
Then I have a few bad days, and then maybe I'm okay again. I mean, where I feel like, oh, I can talk about things without. Um,
All right. Well, best of luck with the rest of your week. Best of luck with
sure.
the chemo and your health and all that. So I'll let you go. Thanks for doing this. This was really interesting.
Mhm.
Have a good one.
You too.